1911. Fall asleep to hilarious history. The Missing Smile and the Billionaire's Divorce by Mark Twain. Copyright 2026. James Henderson. Chapter 1. The Empty Hook at the Louvre. By the year 1911, the world had collectively decided that the 19th century was no longer a guest. It was an aging relative who had overstayed its welcome, smelled vaguely of kerosene, and needed to be shown the door. The 20th century didn't just move in, it arrived like a landlord with a clipboard and a list of evictions. It was a year where human progress was moving so fast that people were beginning to develop a permanent squint from the wind resistance. We were suddenly a species obsessed with the new. We wanted new ways to move, new ways to talk, and, as it turns out, new ways to lose things. The most famous nothing in the world. On the morning of Monday, August 21st, 1911, the Louvre in Paris was closed for maintenance. This was a day typically reserved for the invisible people, the cleaners, the repairmen, and the occasional ghost of a French monarch looking for their head. Among these was a man named Vincenzo Perugia. Vincenzo was an Italian handyman, a man of modest means, but significant nationalistic fervor. He had been hired by the Louvre to build glass cases for some of its more valuable paintings, which meant he had the two things necessary for a successful heist: a white worker's smock and a profound lack of supervision. Vincenzo walked into the Salon Carré, approached a modest-sized portrait of a woman with a smirk that suggested she knew a secret she wasn't telling, and simply took it off the wall. He didn't use grappling hooks. He didn't have a team of acrobats. He didn't even have a getaway driver. He walked into a service closet, removed the frame, which he found a bit bulky for a morning stroll, wrapped his smock around the wooden panel, and walked out the front door. He did encounter a locked door on his way out, but in a display of sheer, unadulterated 1911 logic, he simply unscrewed the doorknob and walked into the Parisian sunlight. The Mona Lisa was gone, and for 24 hours, the Louvre didn't even notice. The greatest triumph of the Mona Lisa wasn't being painted by Leonardo. It was being stolen by a man who looked like he was just looking for a plumbing leak. Mark Twain, the celebrity of absence. When the museum finally realized the painting was missing, the reaction was not one of quiet concern. It was a full-blown Gallic meltdown. The French borders were closed, steamer trunks were searched. The prefect of police was under so much pressure he likely considered arresting the Seine just to show he was doing something. But here is where the hilarious history truly begins. In 1911, the Mona Lisa was not yet the Mona Lisa. She was just another piece of Italian Renaissance art, sitting in a room full of Italian Renaissance art. If you had asked a Parisian on the street in 1910 what the most famous painting in the world was, they might have pointed to a giant mural of a battle or a particularly dramatic Venus. However, the moment she vanished, she became the most famous woman on the planet. For the next 2 years, the Louvre witnessed a phenomenon that defies all rational human behavior. People didn't stop coming to the museum because the painting was gone. On the contrary, attendance skyrocketed. Thousands of people lined up outside the Louvre, paid their entrance fee, and marched solemnly into the Salon Carré just to stare at the empty hook. Humanity, in its infinite wisdom, had decided that a blank space on a wall was far more interesting than the art that had occupied it. People wept at the empty spot. They left flowers. It was the birth of a new kind of celebrity, the missing person fame. We didn't love the lady for her smile. We loved her for the fact that she had successfully ditched us without leaving a forwarding address. The surrealist suspects. The police investigation was a masterclass in hitting the wrong target with incredible precision. Desperate for a culprit, they turned their eyes toward the bohemian element. Enter a young, struggling Spanish artist named Pablo Picasso and his friend, the poet Guillaume Apollinaire. Apollinaire had once shouted that the Louvre should be burned down to make way for modern art, a sentiment that the police took a bit too literally. When it was discovered that a former secretary of Apollinaire's had once stolen some small Iberian statues from the Louvre and sold them to Picasso, the police swooped in. Imagine, if you will, Pablo Picasso in a police interrogation room, sweating under a dim bulb, trying to explain that while he was certainly interested in deconstructing reality, he hadn't actually deconstructed the museum's inventory. Picasso eventually broke down in tears in front of a judge, claiming he didn't even know who Apollinaire was, a lie so transparent it could have been a window. Eventually, the police realized that a cubist and a poet were far too disorganized to pull off a heist that required being awake at 7 a.m. on a Monday. They were released, leaving the Mona Lisa to her 2-year sabbatical in a trunk under Vincenzo's bed. The handyman's patriotism? Vincenzo Perugia didn't sell the painting. He didn't cut it up. He kept it in a false-bottom trunk in his boarding house, just a few blocks from the Louvre. He lived with the most famous woman in the world for 2 years, likely using the crate as a side table for his coffee. His motivation, he later claimed, was patriotism. He believed Napoleon had stolen the painting from Italy, ignoring the fact that Leonardo da Vinci had actually sold it to King Francis I of France quite legally. Vincenzo wanted to return the lady to her rightful home. In 1913, he finally tried to return it by contacting an art dealer in Florence. He expected a hero's welcome and perhaps a small convenience fee for his trouble. Instead, he got the Italian police and a prison sentence so short it was practically a suggestion. The Italians, secretly proud that the painting was back on their soil, gave him 7 months. He served it, went to war, and later opened a paint shop. The Mona Lisa, meanwhile, was returned to France after a triumphant tour of Italy. But she wasn't the same woman who had left. She was now an icon. She had been on every newspaper front page from New York to Tokyo. She was the woman who had fooled the world, the lady who had taken a 2-year vacation and come back a superstar. The lesson of the hook. The events of 1911 taught us something profound about the human psyche that remains true in the age of the Internet. We are far more obsessed with what is missing than what is present. If the Louvre had simply added a second Mona Lisa, nobody would have cared. But by giving us an empty hook, they gave us a mirror. We stared at that blank wall and saw our own curiosity, our own capacity for conspiracy, and our own desperate need to be part of a moment. 1911 was the year we realized that fame isn't about quality. It's about the narrative. A painting is just oil on wood until someone decides to put it under their coat and walk out of a door with a broken doorknob. As the year progressed, this theme of out with the old, in with the spectacularly weird would continue. While Paris was mourning a painting, America was dismantling the largest monopoly in history, and a man in Indiana was bolting a mirror to a car because he was too antisocial to hire a mechanic to sit next to him. The landlord of the 20th century was just getting started, and the rent was going to be paid in high-speed chases, broken trusts, and the occasional science experiment for breakfast. But for one brief shining moment in the summer of 1911, the most important thing in the world was a square of dust on a wallpapered wall in Paris. And if that isn't the most human thing you've ever heard, you're clearly not paying enough attention to the hooks in your own life. Chapter 2. The Execution of Standard Oil. If 1911 began with the French losing a painting, it continued with the American government trying to find its spine. For decades, the United States had been less of a representative democracy and more of a very large collection of assets managed by 6 guys in top hats. At the very top of that heap sat John D. Rockefeller, a man who didn't just want to participate in the oil market, he wanted to be the oil market. By the time the Supreme Court finished with him in May of 1911, the world learned a very important lesson. If you try to own the entire planet, the government will eventually ask you to share, at least with 34 of yourself. The man who owned the light. To understand the execution of Standard Oil, you first have to understand John D. Rockefeller. John was a man of intense discipline, few words, and a relationship with money that can only be described as monogamous and obsessive. He didn't smoke, he didn't drink, and his only hobbies seemed to be giving away shiny new dimes to children while simultaneously crushing their father's small businesses into fine, oily dust. Rockefeller's company, Standard Oil, was the ultimate trust. In the late 19th century, trust was a word that meant a group of companies that have decided to stop fighting each other and start fighting the consumer. Standard Oil controlled roughly 90% of the oil refining business in the United States. John D. Rockefeller's idea of a fair market was one where everyone had the freedom to buy exactly what he was selling, at exactly the price he felt like charging, on a day when he was feeling particularly generous. Mark Twain. If you wanted to light a lamp in 1900, you were essentially sending a thank you note in the form of currency directly to Rockefeller's doorstep. He owned the wells, the refineries, the pipelines, and, crucially, the railroads that shipped the oil. If a competitor tried to start a refinery, Rockefeller would simply tell the railroads, "If you carry that man's oil, I'll stop giving you mine." The railroads, knowing which side of their bread was buttered and which side was soaked in kerosene, would promptly leave the competitors' barrels rotting on the platform. The gavel falls. The rule of reason. By 1911, the American public was getting a bit tired of the Gilded Age vibe. It's hard to appreciate the majesty of a billionaire's mansion when you're paying 10 times the price for kerosene because he's decided he needs a 4th ballroom. The Sherman Antitrust Act had been sitting on the books since 1890, mostly gathering dust and being used by lawyers as a very expensive paperweight. But on May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court finally decided to see if the law actually worked. In a landmark decision, the court ruled that Standard Oil was an unreasonable monopoly. They introduced something called the rule of reason, which is one of those wonderful legal terms that sounds like it was invented by a man who had just finished a very long lunch. The court essentially said, it's okay to be big, and it's okay to be successful, but if you're being a giant jerk about it, that's where we draw the line. Standard Oil wasn't just big, it was unreasonably predatory. It was the schoolyard bully who didn't just take your lunch money, but also bought the cafeteria and banned you from eating. The Great 34-Way Divorce. The court solution was radical for the time. Dissolve the trust. They gave Standard Oil 6 months to break itself into 34 independent companies. Imagine trying to take a giant 3-tier wedding cake and turning it back into 34 individual cupcakes without losing a single sprinkle. That was the logistical nightmare facing Rockefeller's empire. From this corporate explosion, we got the baby standards. If you've ever filled up your car at a gas station, you're likely participating in the legacy of 1911. Standard Oil of New Jersey became Exxon. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil. Standard Oil of California became Chevron. Continental Oil became Conoco. It was the most high-stakes game of divide and conquer in history. The government figured that by breaking the giant into 34 pieces, these new companies would finally start competing with one another, lowering prices and bringing fairness back to the American dream. The irony of the Hydra. However, there was one tiny detail the Supreme Court overlooked. Mathematics. When Standard Oil was broken up, Rockefeller didn't lose his ownership. He just went from owning 25% of one giant company to owning 25% of 34 smaller companies. And here is where the hilarious history kicks in. Shortly after the breakup, the world realized that these 34 new companies were actually worth more separately than they were as a single unit. As the age of the automobile began to explode, more on that in Chapter 4, the demand for gasoline, once considered a useless byproduct of kerosene refining, skyrocketed. In the year following the execution of his monopoly, John D. Rockefeller's personal wealth didn't shrink. It doubled. The government tried to slay the dragon by cutting off its head, only to realize that they had actually just helped the dragon start 34 new bank accounts, each with its own health insurance plan. Mark Twain. Rockefeller became the world's first billionaire after the government tried to take him down. He sat on his porch in Florida, presumably handing out even shinier dimes, while his net worth reached a level that would make modern tech moguls blush. At his peak, his wealth was equivalent to nearly 3% of the entire U.S. GDP. To put that in perspective, for a modern billionaire to match that, they would need to own enough money to personally pay off the national debt and still have enough left over to buy the moon. The legacy of the Gilded Gavel. The execution of Standard Oil was a turning point for the 20th century. It established the idea that the landlord, the government, could actually walk into the tenants, the corporation's apartment, and tell them they had too many roommates. But it also proved that wealth, much like oil itself, is incredibly hard to contain once it starts flowing. You can break it, you can regulate it, and you can yell at it with a gavel. But at the end of the day, the guy who owns the wells is still the guy who owns the wells. 1911 was the year of the paradox. The government won because they proved they could break the biggest company on earth. The consumer won eventually because competition eventually led to better products. Rockefeller won because he got twice as rich for doing exactly what the court told him to do. As we move forward into 1911, we see this pattern repeating. We were a world trying to impose reason on a century that was inherently unreasonable. We were trying to build rules for a game that was changing faster than we could write them down. And speaking of unreasonable, wait until you hear what we did to the tobacco industry just a few weeks later. It turns out that if you own every cigar in America, the government gets very, very cranky. The takeaway for the sleepy historian. As you drift off tonight, think of John D. Rockefeller. Don't think of him as a robber baron or a monopolist. Think of him as a man who was told he had to share his toys. And in response, he simply made sure there were 34 times as many toys to play with. The 20th century was moving from the era of the one giant thing to the era of the many fast things. And as the smoke cleared from the Supreme Court, the world was ready to stop worrying about oil for a moment and start worrying about something even more addictive: tobacco. But that, my friends, is a story for the next time your eyes start to feel like they've been dipped in heavy crude. For now, just remember, if someone tells you that you're too big to fail, they're usually just setting you up for a very profitable breakup. Chapter 3: The American Tobacco Trust, Smolders. In the grand mahogany-scented theater of 1911, the United States Supreme Court was having what we in the business call a hot streak. After decades of being treated like a polite suggestion, much like a "please keep off the grass" sign in a public park, the court had suddenly realized that it possessed a gavel, and by George, it was going to use it. If May 15th was the day the government took a sledgehammer to the oil industry, May 29th was the day they decided to check the pockets of the men in the velvet smoking jackets. Only 2 weeks after the Standard Oil decision, the court turned its collective squinting gaze toward James Buchanan Buck Duke and the American Tobacco Company. It turns out that owning 90% of everything that could be set on fire and inhaled was considered, in the legal parlance of the time, a bit much. The man who mechanized the vice. To understand the American Tobacco Trust, you have to understand Buck Duke. While Rockefeller was obsessed with the liquid that moved the world, Duke was obsessed with the leaves that helped the world relax. Or more accurately, the leaves that made the world nervous enough to buy more leaves. Before Buck Duke came along, tobacco was a messy, artisanal affair. You smoked a pipe, you chewed a plug, or you rolled your own cigarette with the dexterity of a surgeon, usually ending up with more tobacco on your pants than in your mouth. But Buck Duke was a man of the future. In the 1880s, he bet the farm on a contraption called the Bonsack machine. The Bonsack machine was the Henry Ford moment for nicotine. It could roll 200 cigarettes a minute, which was roughly 199 more than the fastest human hands could manage without developing permanent cramps. Suddenly, Duke had a mountain of cigarettes and nobody to smoke them. In a display of marketing genius that would make a modern advertiser weep, he didn't just sell a product, he created a habit. He put collectible cards in the packs. He sponsored everything that stood still long enough to have a poster pasted on it. And he slashed prices until every other tobacco company in the country was staring at an empty bank account. Buck Duke didn't just want to sell you a cigarette, He wanted to ensure that every time you took a breath, you owed him a fraction of a cent for the privilege. Mark Twain. The Big Five and the Art of the Squeeze. By 1890, Duke had forced his four largest competitors to wave the white flag. They merged to form the American Tobacco Company, often referred to as the Tobacco Trust. This wasn't a friendly neighborhood association. This was a corporate octopus. If you were a farmer in North Carolina, you sold your tobacco to Duke at the price Duke wanted, or you let it rot in the barn. If you were a corner grocer, you sold Duke cigarettes, or you found yourself unable to stock matches, pipes, or even the morning paper. Duke's strategy was simple: total domination. He moved into England, he moved into China, and he eventually controlled everything from the tinfoil used in the packaging to the licorice used for flavoring. He was the king of a cloud of blue smoke, and for 20 years, the air was very, very profitable. The court's second act. When the Supreme Court looked at the Tobacco Trust in May of 1911, they didn't see a miracle of modern manufacturing. They saw a monopoly and restraint of trade. Chief Justice Edward Douglas White, a man whose mustache was large enough to have its own zip code, penned the decision. He essentially told the Tobacco Trust the same thing he'd told Standard Oil. You've been unreasonable. The court ruled that the American Tobacco Company had been formed with the express purpose of stifling competition. They didn't just grow large, they grew aggressive. They were the corporate equivalent of a man who goes to a potluck dinner and eats everyone else's potato salad before they can even get through the door. The mandate was clear: break it up. The birth of the modern brands. The dissolution of the Tobacco Trust was even more complex than the oil breakup. It took 6 months of legal bickering, during which Duke famously complained that the government was trying to unscramble an egg. But unscramble it they did. From the ruins of the trust emerged the names that would dominate the 20th century landscape. R.J. Reynolds, who gave us Camel and revolutionized the industry all over again. Liggett and Myers, the creators of Chesterfield. Lorillard, the oldest of the bunch, finally allowed to breathe on its own. The New American Tobacco Company, a smaller, humbler version of its former self. For the first time in decades, there was competition. Of course, in 1911, competition meant that 5 different companies were now competing to see who could tell the most convincing lie about how smoking was actually good for your T-zone and vocal cords. The irony of the ash. Much like the Standard Oil breakup, the execution of the Tobacco Trust had some unintended side effects. First, Buck Duke remained incredibly wealthy. He took his massive payout and turned his attention to a small side project, hydroelectric power. He founded Duke Power and donated so much money to a small college in North Carolina that they renamed it Duke University. So, if you've ever cheered for a Blue Devils basketball game, you are witnessing the direct filtered result of 1911 antitrust litigation. Second, the breakup actually accelerated the cigarette's dominance. With 5 companies now fighting for market share, advertising budgets tripled. They invented new blends, new packaging, and new ways to convince the public that a toasted leaf was somehow a health tonic. The government had successfully broken the monopoly, but they hadn't broken the habit. They had simply replaced one giant dragon with 4 or 5 very hungry, very well-funded tigers. The Supreme Court thought they were clearing the air. Instead, they just ensured that instead of one man holding the matches, we now had 5 men competing to see who could start the biggest fire. Mark Twain. A year of legal renovations. As the smoke cleared from the tobacco decision, the summer of 1911 settled over America. People were starting to realize that the world was being redesigned by men in black robes. The Gilded Age of the 19th century, where a few men owned the railroads, the oil, and the tobacco, was being officially foreclosed upon. But 1911 wasn't just about lawyers and boardrooms. While the wealthy were busy counting their newly divided shares, the rest of the world was looking for a distraction. They were looking for something fast, something dangerous, and something that didn't involve a Supreme Court brief. They were looking for a 500-mile race in a dusty field in Indiana. The takeaway for the drowsy. As you settle into your pillow, consider the Tobacco Trust. It was a giant empire built on smoke and mirrors, eventually brought down by a man with a very large mustache and a very heavy gavel. It reminds us that nothing, no matter how standard or how American it claims to be, is permanent. The world of 1911 was learning that progress often means breaking things into smaller pieces just to see how they work. The air might not have been cleaner after May 29th, but the game was certainly more interesting. And as the lawyers packed their bags for the summer, a group of men in goggles and leather caps were heading to Indianapolis to prove that if you want to be truly unreasonable, you shouldn't use a monopoly. You should use a combustion engine. But that is a story of speed, grease, and the invention of the rear-view mirror, which we shall explore when you are next ready to travel at the blistering, terrifying speed of 75 miles per hour. For now, let the gavel-banging fade into the distance. The trusts are broken, the shares are distributed, and the 20th century is just warming up. Sleep well, knowing that even if you can't unscramble an egg, you can always donate the shells to a university. Chapter 4. The inaugural Indianapolis 500. If 1911 had a soundtrack, it wouldn't be a symphony or a folk song. It would be the sound of 1,000 angry bees trapped in a tin can, amplified by a megaphone, and set on fire. This was the year that America decided that traveling at the speed of a brisk horse was no longer sufficient for the modern soul. We wanted to go fast. We wanted to go loud. And most importantly, we wanted to do it in a circle until our teeth rattled loose and our vision blurred into a kaleidoscope of dust and castor oil. Welcome to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, a place where common sense went to die and mechanical hubris was born in a cloud of exhaust. The Brickyard, a pavement of pain. Before we get to the race, we must discuss the track. In its early days, the Indianapolis Speedway was surfaced with crushed stone and tar. This turned out to be a minor tactical error, as the cars essentially acted as high-powered sandpaper, grinding the track into a lethal spray of flying pebbles that blinded drivers and turned spectators into reluctant geology exhibits. The owners, realizing that killing their customer base in the first 10 minutes was bad for the long-term business model, decided to repave the entire 2.5-mile circuit with 3.2 million paving bricks. Thus, the Brickyard was born. It was a surface so unforgiving that driving on it was less like racing and more like voluntarily participating in a 500-mile vibratory massage administered by a tectonic plate. On May 30th, 1911, 40 cars lined up for the first ever Indianapolis 500. The prize was a staggering $27,500, enough money in those days to buy a small town, or at least enough liniment to treat the back injuries sustained during the race. The Marmon Wasp and the missing passenger. Enter Ray Harone. Ray was an engineer and a driver who approached racing with the cold, calculating logic of a man who actually wanted to survive the afternoon. He drove a car called the Marmon Wasp, so named because it was painted a garish yellow and black and featured a pointed tail that made it look like a very fast, very angry insect. In 1911, racing was a team sport. Every car carried two people, the driver and the riding mechanic. The mechanic's job was a charming mix of high-stakes maintenance and primitive radar. He would manually pump oil, watch the tires for signs of impending disintegration, and, most importantly, constantly look over his shoulder to scream at the driver whenever a rival car was trying to pass. Ray Harone, however, looked at the riding mechanic and saw only one thing: weight. Ray figured that if he could ditch the 150-pound mechanic, his Marmon Wasp would be faster, leaner, and significantly less crowded. But there was a problem. The other drivers were outraged. They argued that racing without a second set of eyes was suicidal. How would Ray know if someone was coming up behind him? How would he know if he was about to be turned into a yellow and black hood ornament? The racing community in 1911 believed that a man could not possibly be expected to know what was happening behind him without the assistance of another man shouting in his ear. It was a time when collaboration was just another word for having someone to blame when you hit a wall. Mark Twain. The invention of the rearview mirror. Ray Harone's solution was a masterpiece of I'd rather not talk to anyone today engineering. He had seen a horse-drawn carriage a few years prior that used a small mirror to keep an eye on the traffic behind. He decided to apply this radical domestic furniture technology to his race car. He bolted a 3-by-8-inch piece of glass to a bracket on his dashboard. It was the world's first rear-view mirror. The other drivers were skeptical. They thought a piece of glass was a poor substitute for a shouting mechanic. They expected Harone to be a menace on the track. But Harone had a secret. He also understood the physics of the long game. While everyone else was treating the race like a sprint, Harone had calculated that the key to winning 500 miles was not going the fastest, but not having your engine explode into a shower of Victorian scrap metal. 6.5 hours of vibrating towards glory. The race itself was a chaotic, grease-soaked marathon. It lasted nearly 7 hours. For perspective, that is roughly the same amount of time it takes for a modern person to decide what to watch on Netflix, but with significantly more chance of a tire blowout. The noise was so loud that people miles away thought a small war had broken out in a brickyard. The smoke from the burning castor oil used as lubricant was so thick that the drivers looked like coal miners after the first 50 laps. Harone's mirror worked, though he later admitted it vibrated so violently on the bricks that the reflection was mostly a blurry suggestion of a car rather than a clear image. He didn't see a Stutz coming up on the left. He saw a vaguely red blob that is getting larger and noisier. By mile 400, The field was thinning out. Cars were failing, tires were shredding, and drivers were suffering from brickyard brain, a condition where the constant rattling makes you forget your own name and start believing you are actually a part of the engine. Haroun, cruising along at a steady average of 74.6 miles per hour, took the checkered flag. He won the inaugural Indy 500, proving that a mirror and a lack of passengers were the ultimate competitive advantages. The legacy, looking back to move forward. Ray Haroun won the race, took his prize money, and promptly retired. He decided that one day of having his skeleton rearranged by 3 million bricks was quite enough for one lifetime. He went back to engineering, leaving behind a legacy that every single one of us uses today. Every time you sit in your car and adjust that little mirror to make sure you aren't about to merge into a semi-truck, you are paying homage to a man in 1911 who just didn't want to carry a mechanic. The rearview mirror was a technological milestone that perfectly encapsulated the year 1911. It was about independence. We were no longer relying on the riding mechanic of the old world. We were taking control of our own perspective. We were looking behind us, not out of nostalgia for the 19th century, but because we wanted to make sure nobody was going to pass us as we sped into the future. In 1911, humanity finally figured out how to see where they had been without having to turn their heads. It was a wonderful invention, though it did mean we no longer had an excuse for accidentally running over the neighbor's prize-winning petunias. Mark Twain. The takeaway for the tucking in. As you close your eyes, imagine the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of tires on 3 million bricks. Imagine the smell of hot oil and the sight of a yellow car disappearing into a cloud of dust. We are moving into an era of speed. The horse is being retired to the pasture, and the engine is taking its place. But as Ray Haroun taught us, it isn't enough to just go fast. You have to know who's gaining on you. The 20th century is accelerating. The rearview mirror is in place. We can see the Gilded Age fading away in the reflection, and the road ahead is wide, dusty, and full of people trying to fly across the entire country in a VinFizz. But that is a story for the next time your internal engine needs to cool down. For now, just be thankful that your car has a windshield and that you don't have to pay a man to sit in your passenger seat and scream about the traffic. Sleep fast, dream in yellow and black, and remember, if the world starts to vibrate, you're probably just winning the race. Chapter 5. The VinFizz flies across America. In the autumn of 1911, the American public was suffering from a collective case of altitude fever. Having successfully conquered the horizontal world with the automobile and the railroad, we decided that the only way to truly celebrate our species' brilliance was to hurl ourselves into the sky in contraptions made of piano wire, canvas, and hope. The Wright brothers had opened the door a few years prior, but by 1911, the question wasn't just, can we fly, but can we fly across the entire continent without becoming a permanent part of the Kansas landscape? Enter William Randolph Hearst, a man who viewed the world as a giant chessboard where he was the only player allowed to move the pieces. Hearst offered a staggering prize of $50,000, roughly the equivalent of several $1,000,000 today, or enough to buy a very large island and retire from the newspaper business, to the first pilot who could fly from New York to California in 30 days or less. It was a generous offer, provided you didn't mind the fact that the technology of 1911 had the structural integrity of an expensive kite and the reliability of a politician's campaign promise. The pilot, the cigar, and the soda. The man who stepped up to the plate was Galbraith Perry Rogers. Cal, as he was known to people who didn't want to spend 20 minutes pronouncing his name, was a tall, lanky fellow with a lineage that suggested he belonged in a history book. He was the grandson of Commodore Matthew Perry, the man who opened Japan, and the grandnephew of Oliver Hazard Perry, the hero of the Battle of Lake Erie. Given his family history, Galbraith felt he had a genetic obligation to do something heroic involving a vehicle. He was also profoundly deaf, which, in the context of 1911 aviation, was actually a competitive advantage. It meant he couldn't hear the engines screaming in agony, nor could he hear the terrified shrieks of the birds as he wobbled past them. However, aviation is an expensive hobby, and Cal needed a sponsor. He found one in the Armour Meatpacking Company, which had just launched a new grape-flavored soda called Vin Fizz. Vin Fizz was a beverage that allegedly tasted like a mixture of battery acid, grape skins, and regret. It was marketed as a health tonic, which in 1911 meant it probably wouldn't kill you immediately, but it might make you wish it had. Mark Twain. In exchange for painting the Vin Fizz logo on his wings and tail, Galbraith was given a dedicated support train, the Vin Fizz Flyer, filled with spare parts, mechanics, and enough grape soda to preserve a medium-sized mammoth. The flight of 1,000 crashes. Galbraith took off from Sheepshead Bay, New York, on September 17, 1911. His plan was to follow the railroad tracks, which in 1911 was the only reliable form of GPS. If he saw a train, he was heading in the right direction. If he saw a cow that looked confused, he was probably over Ohio. The journey was not what you would call smooth. In fact, calling it a flight is a bit of a linguistic stretch. It was more of a series of high-velocity encounters with the ground, interrupted by brief periods of being airborne. Galbraith crashed on his first day, he crashed on his second day, he crashed in New Jersey, he crashed in New York, and he famously crashed into a chicken coop in Pennsylvania. By the time he reached the Midwest, the Vin Fizz looked less like an airplane and more like a collection of scrap wood that had been loosely organized by a hurricane. The 30-day deadline set by Hearst came and went, while Galbraith was still trying to figure out how to get over the Rocky Mountains. Hearst, being a man of his word, which is to say, a man who liked keeping his $50,000, withdrew the prize. But Galbraith Perry Rogers was a man possessed. He had a cigar clamped between his teeth and a contract with a grape soda company, and by George, he was going to see the Pacific Ocean. The ship of Theseus, with wings. The most remarkable part of the Vin Fizz journey wasn't the distance, it was the persistence of the hardware. Because Galbraith crashed so frequently, recording 70 landings, most of them unscheduled, the plane had to be rebuilt constantly. The mechanics on the support train became the fastest carpenters in the Western Hemisphere. They replaced wings, propellers, rudders, and engines as if they were changing socks. By the time the Vin Fizz finally wobbled into Pasadena, California on November 5, 1911, the only original parts left on the aircraft were the vertical rudder, the oil drip pan, and a few struts. Calbraith Perry Rogers didn't fly one airplane across America. He flew about 16 different airplanes that all happened to share the same name and a very sticky logo. Mark Twain. He had traveled roughly 4,000 miles in 84 days. His actual flying time was about 82 hours, which means he spent the other 1,934 hours either falling out of the sky, waiting for the glue to dry, or trying to explain to an angry farmer why there was a Wright Flyer in his cornfield. The hero's wet welcome. Though he missed the prize money, Calbraith became a national hero. He was the first human being to see both the Atlantic and the Pacific from the same seat, assuming it was the same seat, which is statistically unlikely. He decided to finish the job properly by flying all the way to the water's edge in Long Beach. On the final leg, he crashed again, this time into the surf, breaking his legs and ending up in the hospital. He eventually made it to the water on crutches, proving that while gravity is a law, Calbraith Perry Rogers viewed it merely as a polite suggestion that he chose to ignore. Sadly, Calbraith's luck with the sky ran out just a few months later during an exhibition flight, but his 1911 journey remains a monument to the era of the amateur. It was a time when you didn't need a flight plan, a radio, or even a functioning airplane to make history. All you needed was a support train, a cigar, and a sponsor who sold a soda that tasted like the color purple. The legacy of the grape soda flyer. The Vin Fizz flight taught the world that the American continent was shrinkable. It proved that the sky was not a barrier, but a highway, provided you were willing to rebuild your vehicle 70 times along the way. It also established the grand American tradition of corporate sponsorship. Long before NASCAR drivers were covered in stickers, the Vin Fizz was soaring and crashing as a giant billboard for a beverage. It was the birth of the modern adventure, where the hero's journey is brought to you by a middle manager in a marketing department. As Calbraith's plane was eventually tucked away into the Smithsonian, the world of 1911 turned its eyes back to the ground. While one man was struggling to fly across the country, another group of men were starting a company that would ensure nobody ever had to fly, because they'd have a stylish, affordable car to drive instead. The takeaway for the sleepy. As you drift off, think of the Vin Fizz. Think of a plane that was more bandaged than aircraft, wobbling across the Great Plains at the speed of a determined bicycle. History isn't just made by the people who succeed on the first try. It's made by the people who are willing to crash 70 times, rebuild their wings, and keep going because they promised a grape soda company they'd reach the beach. The 20th century was about to get much more efficient, but it would never again be quite this delightfully disorganized. So, rest easy. Your bed is on solid ground, there are no chicken coops in your immediate flight path, and you don't have to drink any 1911-era grape soda to get where you're going. Tomorrow, we'll talk about Louis Chevrolet and William Durant, who decided that if you're going to be on the ground, you might as well do it with a bit of bow tie flair. But for now, let the sound of a sputtering right engine fade into the distance. The Pacific is waiting, and the cigar is still lit. Chapter 6. Chevrolet enters the fray. By late 1911, the American roadway was beginning to look like a very long, very dusty funeral procession. This was entirely the fault of Henry Ford. Henry had gifted the world the Model T, a machine so reliable, so affordable, and so aggressively utilitarian that it had practically erased the concept of choice from the human brain. Henry's famous dictum that a customer could have a car painted any color he wanted so long as it was black wasn't just a manufacturing strategy. It was a psychological warfare tactic. He wanted the American public to view the automobile not as an expression of soul, but as a toaster with wheels. It was a tool for getting from the farm to the church without the horse dying of heat stroke. But in November of 1911, two men decided that the American road needed a bit more va-va-voom, and significantly more ways for a man to feel superior to his neighbor. These men were William "Billy" Durant and Louis Chevrolet. Their partnership was a classic tale of a man who could sell ice to an Eskimo teaming up with a man who could build a refrigerator out of a pocket watch and a prayer. The salesman and the speed demon. Billy Durant was the ultimate corporate phoenix. He was the man who had founded General Motors by snapping up every car company he could find, Buick, Oldsmobile, Cadillac, like a hungry toddler in a toy store. However, Billy's enthusiasm for buying companies was not matched by his ability to actually pay for them. By 1910, his bankers had staged a coup, kicked him out of his own boardroom, and told him to go find a new hobby that didn't involve bankrupting the entire state of Michigan. But Billy Durant didn't do hobbies, he did empires. To get his revenge on the bankers, Billy needed a new hit. He needed a name that sounded like speed, luxury, and perhaps a hint of expensive perfume. He found it in Louis Chevrolet. Louis was a Swiss-born, French-raised racing driver with a mustache that required its own zip code and a lead foot that made him a legend on the dirt tracks of the early 1900s. To the American public, Chevrolet didn't just mean a car. It meant a man who had stared death in the face at 70 miles per hour and told death to watch the exhaust. Louis Chevrolet was a man who believed that if a car didn't make your heart leap into your throat and stay there for the duration of the trip, you might as well be riding a very depressed mule. Mark Twain. The birth of the bow tie. On November 3, 1911, the Chevrolet Motor Car Company was officially incorporated in Detroit. Billy Durant provided the money and the marketing genius. Louis Chevrolet provided the engineering and the glamorous name. Immediately, the two men ran into a problem. They had absolutely no idea what they were building. Louis wanted to build a Swiss watch on wheels. He envisioned a massive, powerful, high-end machine that would cost a fortune and make the owner feel like a duke. Billy Durant, however, was looking at the sales charts for the Model T and realizing that there were a lot more farmers than there were dukes. He wanted a Model T killer, something stylish enough to make a Ford look like a coal scuttle, but cheap enough that a man wouldn't have to sell his youngest child to afford the down payment. While they argued about the engine, they also had to figure out the branding. The Chevrolet bow tie logo is one of the great mysteries of the 20th century, mostly because Billy Durant couldn't keep his story straight about where it came from. In one version, he claimed he saw the pattern on the wallpaper of a hotel in Paris and tore a piece off to show his wife. In another version, he claimed he saw it in a newspaper advertisement for Coalettes, a brand of fuel. Regardless of its origin, the bow tie gave Chevrolet something Ford didn't have: identity. A Ford was just a car. A Chevrolet was a car with a tuxedo on. The classic corporate divorce. The partnership between the salesman and the racer lasted about as long as a 1911 tire on a gravel road. By 1913, Louis Chevrolet was fed up. He was an artist of grease and iron, and he was tired of Billy Durant trying to turn his masterpiece into a people's car. The final straw, according to legend, involved a cigarette. Louis was a man of European sensibilities. He liked his fancy cigarettes and his fancy cars. Billy, a man of Midwestern restraint, told Louis he should act more like an American businessman and stop smoking those stinky cigarettes. Louis, in a fit of Gallic pique, told Billy where he could shove his company, sold his shares, and walked out. It was perhaps the most expensive cigarette in human history. Had Louis kept his shares, he would eventually become one of the wealthiest men on the planet. Instead, he went back to racing and engineering, eventually dying in relative obscurity, while his name became a household word that people shouted at football games. History is full of men who walked away from a gold mine because they didn't like the color of the shovel. Louis Chevrolet gave the world his name, but he kept his dignity and his cigarettes, which in the long run is a very French way to go bankrupt. Mark Twain. The counterattack on Ford. With Louis gone, Billy Durant was free to turn Chevrolet into the juggernaut he had always envisioned. He launched the Series 490, so named because it cost exactly $490, which was $5 less than the Model T at the time. Billy wasn't just selling a car, he was selling aspiration. He realized that even a man who could only afford a basic car wanted to feel like he was part of the modern world. Chevrolet offered things Ford didn't: an electric starter, so you didn't have to risk a broken arm cranking the engine, a bit of chrome, and the aforementioned bow tie. By 1916, Chevrolet had become so successful that Billy Durant used the profits to stage a reverse merger. He bought up enough General Motors stock to walk back into the boardroom that had kicked him out and say, "I'm back, and I brought the Swiss racer's name with me." The great Ford versus Chevy rivalry had begun, a civil war of the suburban driveway that would split families, define social classes, and ensure that "which car do you drive?" became a more important question than "what do you believe in?" The legacy of the bow tie. The founding of Chevrolet in 1911 marked the end of the monolithic era of the car. It proved that the 20th century wasn't just going to be about efficiency, it was going to be about choice. We didn't just want to move, we wanted to move in a way that reflected our personality. We wanted to choose between the black Ford and the blue Chevy. We wanted to argue about overhead valves versus flatheads. We wanted to be Chevy people or Ford people. As the first Chevrolets rolled off the line in Detroit, the world was becoming a place of brands, logos, and fierce loyalties. We were no longer just customers. We were consumers. And we were beginning to realize that the things we bought defined the people we were. The takeaway for the tucking in. As you settle into your blankets, think of Billy Durant and Louis Chevrolet. One had the name, and the other had the plan. Together, they gave us the bow tie, the rivalry, and the electric starter. History is often a collision between the person who wants to make something perfect and the person who wants to make something for everyone. And while they rarely get along, the world usually ends up with a better car because of the argument. The 20th century is now fully in gear. We have the oil, we have the broken trusts, we have the rear view mirror, And now we have the competition. The road ahead is getting crowded, and the black paint is finally starting to dry. Tomorrow, we leave the factory floor and head to the mountains of Peru, where a man in a fedora is about to discover something that the locals have been using as a vegetable garden for generations. But for now, let the sound of a 1911 engine, whether it's a Ford or a Chevy, hum you to sleep. Just make sure you check the oil before you drift off. Chapter 7. Machu Picchu, the discovery of the obvious. While the Americans were busy breaking up oil trusts and the French were wandering around the Louvre looking for a missing smile, a man named Hiram Bingham III was trekking through the Peruvian Andes with a very specific goal. He wanted to find something that was lost, preferably something made of stone that couldn't run away. Bingham was a Yale professor, a man of immense ambition, and possessed a collection of hats that would later inspire a certain cinematic archaeologist with a whip. In the summer of 1911, he was leading the Yale Peruvian expedition. He wasn't just looking for any old pile of rocks. He was looking for Vilcabamba, the lost city of the Incas, the final stronghold where the indigenous royalty supposedly hid from the Spanish and their rather aggressive approach to cultural exchange. On July 24, 1911, Bingham discovered Machu Picchu, and I use the word discovered in the same way a teenager discovers that there is milk in the refrigerator. It was already there. Several people were already using it, and he was simply the first person to write a scholarly paper about it in English. The Professor and the Guide. Hiram Bingham was not a man who enjoyed the quiet life of a library. He preferred the kind of history that required a mule and a significant amount of mosquito repellent. He was convinced that the secret to the Inca Empire was hidden somewhere in the impenetrable green folds of the Urubamba Valley. However, impenetrable is a relative term. To a Yale professor, a mountain covered in jungle is a mystery. To the people who actually live there, it's just the way to the market. As Bingham hacked his way through the undergrowth, he encountered a local farmer named Melchor Arteaga. Bingham asked him if there were any ruins nearby. Arteaga, likely wondering why this sweaty man in a fedora was so excited about old masonry, replied, "Oh, you mean the big stone city up on the ridge? Sure, it's right up there. Would you like to see it? It'll cost you a silver dollar." This is the central comedy of exploration in 1911. The great explorer arrives, exhausted and triumphant, only to find that the lost city is currently being used as a very scenic potato patch. To discover a city that has been there for 500 years is a uniquely Western talent. It requires a profound ability to ignore the three families currently living in the living room while you marvel at the architecture of the foyer. Mark Twain. The magnificent nothing. When Bingham finally crested the ridge and saw the granite terraces of Machu Picchu emerging from the mist, he was, to his credit, floored. It was an engineering miracle. The Incas had built a city on a mountain saddle without the use of iron tools, wheels, or even a decent blueprint. The stones were fitted together so precisely that you couldn't slip a blade between them, which was fortunate, as the Spanish had spent several centuries trying to do exactly that to the Incas themselves. But Bingham's first realization wasn't about the beauty of the site. It was about the occupancy. When he reached the ruins, he didn't find the ghosts of Inca kings. He found two local families, the Richart and the Alvarez, who had been living on the terraces for years. They were using the original Inca water system to grow their crops. They had cleared the brush, they were enjoying the lack of taxes, and they were generally having a lovely time until the man from Yale showed up with a camera and a notebook. To the locals, the lost city wasn't a mystery, it was home. To Bingham, it was a scientific breakthrough. History is often just a matter of who owns the most expensive printing press. The naming rights of history. Bingham spent the rest of 1911 and much of 1912 excavating the site. He shipped thousands of artifacts, pottery, silver, bones, back to Yale for study. This would later lead to a century-long legal argument between Peru and Yale that made the Standard Oil divorce look like a polite disagreement over a dinner bill. He also gave the world the name Machu Picchu. In Quechua, it translates roughly to Old Peak. It wasn't the Vilcabamba he was looking for. That was actually further into the jungle, but Machu Picchu was much more photogenic. But he decided it would do. Bingham's discovery turned Machu Picchu into a global brand. Suddenly, the world was obsessed with the idea of lost civilizations. We loved the idea that there were places the 20th century hadn't touched, places where the landlord couldn't find you and the Supreme Court had no jurisdiction. The irony of the map. The discovery of Machu Picchu perfectly encapsulated the 1911 ethos. Everything must be labeled. This was the year humanity decided that if a place wasn't on a map designed in London, Paris, or New York, it didn't officially exist. We were filling in the blanks of the world, often by drawing lines right over the people who had been standing there the whole time. Bingham was a hero because he found what was never really lost. He was an adventurer who brought the 15th century into the 20th, allowing us to marvel at the Incas while we simultaneously built assembly lines and dropped grenades out of airplanes. It was a way for us to look back at the ancient while we were hurtling toward the atomic. Speaking of which, while Bingham was staring at giant stones in Peru, a man in England was staring at something much, much smaller. And while Bingham found a city that was mostly empty, this other man was about to find out that the entire universe was made of, well, nothing. 1911 was the year we realized that the largest things on Earth, like Inca cities, were easy to miss, and the smallest things in the universe, like the atom, were mostly made of air. It's a miracle we managed to find our own boots in the morning. Mark Twain. The takeaway for the dreaming. As you drift off tonight, think of the stone terraces of Machu Picchu. Think of the clouds drifting through the granite doorways and the silent peaks of the Andes. Remember that discovery is often just a change in perspective. The city was always there. It just needed a man in a hat to tell the rest of the world to look up. History is a collection of stories told by the people who kept the best journals. So, as you close your eyes, don't worry about being lost. Even if you're tucked away in the furthest corner of your dreams, there's probably a Yale professor somewhere trying to find you, but he'll have to pay a silver dollar to the locals first, sleep high in the mountains where the air is thin and the stories are old. Tomorrow, we leave the heights of Peru for the depths of the atom, where Ernest Rutherford is about to prove that your solid mattress is actually just a collection of tiny buzzing electrical storms. But for now, The jungle is quiet. The llamas are asleep, and the lost city is found, at least until the next tourist season. Chapter 8. Rutherford Pokes the Atom. While Hiram Bingham was in Peru marveling at rocks so large they had their own gravity, a New Zealander in Manchester named Ernest Rutherford was busy looking at something so small that, for all practical purposes, it didn't exist. If 1911 was the year we realized the world was shrinking, thanks to planes, and the law was expanding, thanks to the Supreme Court, it was also the year we realized that reality itself was a complete and utter fraud. We had spent thousands of years believing that solid matter was, well, solid. We believed a table was a table, a rock was a rock, and a Victorian corset was a structural necessity. But Rutherford was about to prove that everything you can touch, see, or accidentally stub your toe on is actually 99.99% empty space. The dessert before the storm, the plum pudding model. To understand why Rutherford's discovery was so shocking, you have to understand what scientists thought an atom looked like in 1910. The leading theory was provided by J.J. Thomson, a man who had discovered the electron but apparently spent far too much time in the university cafeteria. Thomson proposed the plum pudding model. He suggested that an atom was a large, positively charged soup, the pudding, with tiny, negatively charged electrons, the plums, floating around inside it. It was a cozy, delicious view of the universe. It suggested that if you looked closely enough at the fabric of reality, it looked like a dessert your grandmother would serve at Christmas. The plum pudding model was a very comforting idea. It suggested that at the heart of all things, even the most terrifying storms and the most complex machines, there was a soggy British dessert. It was the last time the universe would ever feel quite so appetizing. Mark Twain. The gold foil experiment, shooting at the sun. Rutherford, however, wasn't a pudding man. He was a man of action, radiation, and incredibly thin sheets of metal. He decided to test the pudding. In a dark basement in Manchester, Rutherford, along with his assistants Hans Geiger, yes, the clicking machine guy, and Ernest Marsden, set up an experiment that was elegantly simple and potentially blinding. They took a source of alpha particles, which are essentially tiny, high-speed atomic cannonballs, and fired them at a sheet of gold foil that had been beaten so thin it made a spider's web look like a thick wool rug. According to the plum pudding model, the alpha particles should have sailed right through the pudding, with maybe a slight wobble. It was like throwing a handful of pebbles through a lace curtain. But then, the universe decided to stop behaving. The cannonball and the tissue paper. Most of the particles did indeed zip right through, but to Rutherford's absolute horror, 1 in every 8,000 particles didn't go through the gold. It didn't even wobble. It hit the foil and bounced straight back at the source like a tennis ball hitting a brick wall. Rutherford famously remarked, "It was quite the most incredible event that has ever happened to me in my life. It was almost as incredible as if you fired a 15-inch shell at a piece of tissue paper and it came back and hit you." This is the moment the 20th century officially became weird. Rutherford realized that for a high-speed particle to bounce backward, it had to have hit something incredibly small, incredibly heavy, and incredibly dense. The pudding was gone. In its place was a tiny, hard center that held almost all the mass of the atom. He called it the nucleus, the great atomic void. The implications were, and still are, terrifying. Rutherford calculated that if an atom were the size of a massive cathedral, the nucleus would be the size of a single fly buzzing in the center. The electrons would be tiny specks orbiting near the outer walls. Everything else, every single cubic inch of the cathedral, was nothing, just empty, silent, terrifying space. This means that the chair you are sitting on is not a solid object. It is a collection of tiny flies surrounded by vast amounts of nothingness, held together by electrical forces that are essentially just shouting at each other to keep from collapsing. The only reason you don't fall through the chair and through the floor and into the molten core of the earth is that the electrons in your pants and the electrons in the chair are both negatively charged, and they find each other's company so repulsive that they push away with incredible force. You aren't sitting. You are levitating on a microscopic layer of mutual electron loathing. The existential side effects. 1911 was the year humanity lost its solidity. Before Rutherford, we were solid people in a solid world. After Rutherford, we were mostly vacuum. This explains a great deal about the 20th century. It explains why most political arguments have no substance whatsoever. They are simply following the laws of atomic physics. It explains why your bank account feels like it's mostly empty space, even when you're sure you put something in it. And it explains why, despite our best efforts to be heavy and serious, we are all just a bunch of tiny electrical storms pretending to be coherent beings. Once you realize that you are 99.9% empty space, it makes it very hard to take yourself seriously. It makes it even harder to worry about your mortgage, which is also, incidentally, made of empty space and the electrical repulsion of your banker. Mark Twain. The solar system in a speck. Rutherford's discovery gave us the planetary model of the atom. We began to see the universe as a series of circles within circles. The atom looked like a tiny solar system, which suggested a beautiful, poetic symmetry to the cosmos. As above, so below. The same rules that govern the stars seem to govern the dust on your boots. But while the theory was beautiful, it was also the first step toward the atomic age. By finding the nucleus, Rutherford had found the engine room of the universe. He had found where the power was hidden. In 1911, it was just a curious bit of physics in a Manchester basement. But the fuse had been lit. We had poked the atom, and we were about to find out that when you poke the universe's building blocks, they eventually poke back. The takeaway for the tired. As you lie there in the darkness, consider the fact that your pillow is mostly a void. Your blanket is a collection of microscopic solar systems. Your very thoughts are just electrical signals jumping across the empty cathedrals of your brain. We live in a world of illusions, but they are very sturdy illusions. The nothingness of the atom is what allows us to have everything. So, don't worry about the weight of the world. Statistically speaking, there isn't much weight there at all. It's mostly just space. And space is the perfect place to put your dreams. Sleep deeply, knowing that your electrons have everything under control. They are pushing back against the world so you don't have to. Tomorrow, we'll see what happens when we freeze that nothingness to nearly absolute zero as we visit Heike Kamerlingh Onnes and the birth of superconductivity. But for now, the flies in the cathedral are still. The alpha particles have all gone home, and the universe is perfectly, beautifully, hilariously empty. Chapter 9. The Zero Resistance Miracle. In the sweltering summer of 1911, while the American Supreme Court was sweating through its robes and the rest of the world was busy throwing grenades at each other or discovering Peruvian real estate, a group of very quiet, very patient Dutchmen were busy trying to turn the universe into an ice cube. We have spent much of this year discussing the heat of the world, the friction of the industrial machine, the fire of the tobacco trust, and the literal combustion of the racing engine. But in a laboratory in Leiden, a man named Heike Kamerlingh Onnes was pursuing the opposite extreme. He wasn't interested in the big and fast. He was interested in the slow and silent. He wanted to know what happens to the world when you take away all its warmth and leave it shivering in the absolute basement of existence. On April 8, 1911, Heike discovered superconductivity. It was a breakthrough that promised to revolutionize the world, provided that the world was willing to submerge itself in liquid helium and never touch anything room temperature ever again. The gentleman of absolute zero. Heike Kamerlingh Onnes was the director of the physical laboratory at the University of Leiden. In the scientific circles of the time, he was known as the gentleman of absolute zero. This was not because he was particularly rude at dinner parties, but because he had made it his life's mission to reach the bottom of the thermometer, the point where nature supposedly stops moving and asks for a blanket. The quest for absolute zero, 0 Kelvin or minus 273.15 degrees Celsius, was the high-stakes race to the South Pole, for the nerdier set. It was a place of theoretical perfection, where the entropy of a system reaches its minimum. Scientists believed that if they could get things cold enough, the very laws of physics might start to behave differently. Before he could reach the bottom, Heike had to figure out how to liquefy helium. This was no small feat. Helium is the introvert of the periodic table. It doesn't want to bond with anyone, and it certainly doesn't want to settle down into a liquid state. To liquefy it, Heike had to build a laboratory that looked like a Victorian plumber's fever dream. Miles of copper tubing, giant compressors, and glass vessels that were constantly threatening to shatter into a billion icy shards. In 1908, he finally succeeded, turning helium into a liquid at a temperature so low that even a polar bear would have found it a bit nippy. But in 1911, he decided to see what this cold power could do to a piece of metal. The mercury and the ghost of friction. Heike chose mercury for his experiment. Mercury is a strange substance, a metal that is a liquid at room temperature, making it the only element that can be used both as a structural component and a refreshing, if highly toxic, beverage for the truly confused. Heike froze the mercury until it was a solid wire, and then submerged it in his liquid helium. He was measuring its electrical resistance. Now, normally, when you send electricity through a wire, it's a bit like trying to run through a crowded ballroom. The electrons keep bumping into the atoms of the metal, creating friction and heat. This friction is called resistance. It's why your light bulbs get hot and why your toaster works. In 1911, resistance was considered a fundamental law of nature, a tax that the universe levied on every single electron trying to get from point A to point B. Scientists knew that as things got colder, resistance decreased. They figured that if they got to absolute zero, the resistance would slowly fade away like a politician's memory after an election. But as the temperature of the mercury dropped to 4.2 Kelvin, something impossible happened. The resistance didn't just decrease, it vanished. It fell off a cliff. It ceased to exist. It was as if the ballroom full of people had suddenly turned into a sheet of perfectly smooth ice, and the electrons were no longer running. They were skating at 1,000 miles per hour without so much as a scuff on their boots. Mark Twain. The Miracle of the Infinite Loop. Heike realized he had found a state of matter where electricity could flow forever. In a superconducting loop, you could start a current, take away the battery, and the electricity would just keep spinning around in circles for 1 billion years, or at least until someone accidentally bumped into the table. It was the birth of cold power. It was a miracle of efficiency. If we could make the whole world superconducting, we could send electricity from a power plant in Niagara Falls to a toaster in California without losing a single spark along the way. We could have flying trains, frictionless motors, and computers that didn't require a fan the size of a jet engine to keep from melting. There was, however, one tiny, inconvenient catch. To achieve this miracle, you had to keep the wire at a temperature roughly 4 degrees above the complete absence of all heat. In 1911, maintaining a temperature of 4.2 Kelvin required a laboratory full of expensive Dutchmen, a mountain of liquid helium, and enough safety equipment to survive a trip to the moon. It was the ultimate scientific cleverness. Heike had discovered the key to a frictionless future, but the key was stored in a freezer that cost more than the city of Amsterdam. The century of waiting. The world's reaction to superconductivity in 1911 was essentially, "That is absolutely fascinating, Heike. Now, could you please get back to work on something we can actually use, like a better way to keep the beer cold?" Because the cooling requirements were so extreme, superconductivity remained a laboratory curiosity for decades. It was the Ferrari in the garage of physics, a machine of incredible power that nobody could afford to drive because the gasoline was made of liquid diamonds. Heike Kamerlingh Onnes won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1913 for his work, and he spent the rest of his life being hailed as a genius. But it would take another 70 years before we found materials that could become high-temperature superconductors, which, in the world of physics, means they only need to be as cold as a Tuesday on Pluto, rather than the absolute bottom of the universe. We have spent a century trying to find a way to make the miracle of 1911 work in a world that insists on being 70 degrees and sunny. It is the great human tragedy. We found the secret to eternal movement, but we can't find a thermos big enough to hold it. Mark Twain. The Philosophical Chill. The discovery of superconductivity added another layer to the 1911 realization that reality is weird. First, Rutherford told us we were mostly empty space. Now, Heike was telling us that the laws of friction and resistance were merely suggestions that applied only when things were warm. It suggested that if we looked at the world in the right light or at the right temperature, Everything we thought we knew about the solid, sensible world was a lie. 1911 was the year the universe started showing us its magic tricks. We were pulling back the curtain on the atom, the sky, and the frozen depths of matter. We were finding that the modern age wasn't just about bigger steamships and faster cars. It was about a fundamental shift in how we understood the fabric of existence. But while the scientists were freezing in Mercury, the rest of the human race was continuing its tradition of being loud, messy, and extremely resistant to change. In China, 4,000 years of imperial history were about to melt away, not because of liquid helium, but because of a much more volatile substance, revolution. The takeaway for the tucked in. As you settle into the warmth of your blankets, take a moment to appreciate the resistance of your world. Be thankful for the friction that keeps your feet on the floor and the heat that keeps your toes from turning into superconducting mercury. We live in a warm reality, a place of messiness and friction and slow-moving electrons. And while the zero-resistance miracle is a beautiful dream, there is something to be said for a world that has enough grip to hold a conversation. The Dutch scientists have turned off the compressors for the night. The liquid helium is bubbling quietly in its glass jars. The electrons are skating in their infinite loops, perfectly silent and perfectly cold. Sleep deeply, knowing that the universe is far more mysterious than it looks on the surface. Tomorrow, we leave the frozen quiet of Leiden for the gunpowder and chaos of the Shanghai Revolution. We go from the absolute zero of the lab to the boiling point of an empire. But for now, the thermometer has reached the bottom. The world is still, and the miracle is waiting for a century that can handle it. Chapter 10. The Shanghai Revolution. Goodbye, Qing. If 1911 was the year the West was busy breaking oil trusts and finding lost cities, it was the year the East decided to perform the ultimate structural renovation. For over 2,000 years, China had operated on a very simple, very long-term lease agreement known as the imperial system. It was a tradition that had survived dynasties, invasions, and the invention of everything from gunpowder to the compass. But by 1911, the Qing dynasty, which had been in power since 1644, was looking less like a majestic dragon and more like a very old, very confused turtle that had accidentally wandered onto a high-speed railway track. The lease was up, the landlord was angry, and the tenants were tired of paying rent in the form of dignity and silver. On October 10, 1911, a bomb went off in the city of Wuchang. It wasn't a grand planned signal for a global uprising. It was an accident. But in the world of 1911, an accidental explosion was all it took to turn a 4,000-year-old empire into a very large, very chaotic garage sale. The toddler on the dragon throne. At the center of this crumbling empire sat Puyi, the last emperor. In 1911, Puyi was 5 years old. Imagine, if you will, being 5. Your primary concerns should be the structural integrity of your mashed potatoes, or whether your favorite stick is still in the backyard. Puyi, however, was the son of heaven. He lived in the Forbidden City, a 178-acre complex in Beijing that was essentially the world's most expensive daycare center, guarded by thousands of eunuchs and officials who were legally required to kowtow to a child who still needed help tying his shoes. Puyi's life was a master class in absurdity. He was surrounded by ancient rituals, silken robes, and people who would literally die for him. Yet he wasn't allowed to play with other children or leave the palace. He was a prisoner of his own divinity. To be the absolute ruler of 400 million people before you have mastered the art of not falling off a tricycle is a unique kind of tragedy. It is the only job in the world where your retirement plan is usually a very long walk off a short pier. Mark Twain. The Whoops Revolution. While Puyi was playing with his imperial cricket cages, a group of revolutionaries in Wuchang were busy being incredibly disorganized. They were members of a secret society dedicated to overthrowing the Qing, but their secrecy left much to be desired. On the afternoon of October 9th, a group of these revolutionaries were in their secret headquarters in the Russian concession of Wuchang, busily making bombs. One of the bombs, presumably feeling left out of the conversation, decided to go off prematurely. The smoke attracted the local police, who arrived, looked at the charred remnants of the revolution, and began arresting everyone in sight. They also found a list of all the members of the revolutionary group. This is what we call a professional error. Realizing that they were all about to be executed by dawn, the revolutionaries decided that they had two choices: die quietly in a prison cell or start a world-changing uprising right now, before dinner. They chose the latter. By the morning of October 10th, they had seized the city. The Xinhai Revolution had begun, not with a bang and a roar of liberty, but with a whoops and a oh no, they found the list. The man in the Denver hotel room. Every revolution needs a hero, and for China, that man was Sun Yat-sen. Sun was a doctor, a philosopher, and a professional exile who had spent the last decade traveling the world trying to convince people to give him money to start a republic. When the Xinhai Revolution actually broke out, where was the great leader? Was he leading a charge on a white horse? Was he standing on a barricade with a flag? No. Sun Yat-sen was in Denver, Colorado. He had just finished a speaking tour and was eating breakfast at a hotel when he read in the morning newspaper that a revolution had started in his name back home. He didn't even have a ticket back to China. He spent the next few weeks traveling through Europe to try and convince the British and French not to lend any more money to the Qing dynasty, eventually arriving in Shanghai on Christmas Day like a very late, very confused Santa Claus. The general who liked being in charge. With the revolutionaries holding the South and the Qing holding the North, the situation needed a mediator. Enter Yuan Shikai, a man who possessed a very impressive mustache and a flexible relationship with the concept of loyalty. Yuan Shikai was the commander of the Qing's most modern army. The imperial court begged him to crush the rebels. The rebels, meanwhile, offered him the presidency if he would just tell the emperor to pack his bags. Yuan, being a master of 1911-style opportunism, looked at the 5-year-old on the throne, looked at the disorganized rebels in the South, and decided that he quite liked the sound of President Yuan. He negotiated a deal where Puyi would abdicate, the Qing dynasty would end, and China would become a republic, with Yuan Shikai at the wheel. Yuan Shikai was a man who understood that the best way to win a war is to wait until both sides are exhausted and then step in to accept the trophies. He was the corporate raider of the 20th century, before corporations had even figured out how to raid. Mark Twain. The End of the Dragon. On February 12, 1912, the wrap-up of the 1911 effort, the Edict of Abdication was signed. The Qing dynasty was over. The imperial system, which had defined Chinese life since before the birth of the Roman Empire, was gone in a puff of smoke and a few signature strokes. Puyi was allowed to stay in the Forbidden City, keeping his titles but losing his power, a situation that lasted until the 1920s, when a warlord finally told him he had 20 minutes to leave before they started charging him rent. The Republic of China was born. It was messy, it was fragile, and it was about to enter a period of warlords, civil wars, and enough political drama to fill a library. But the old ways had been evicted. 1911 had proven that even the most ancient, most heavenly institutions weren't immune to the landlord's clipboard. The takeaway for the sleepy: as you settle into your pillow, think of the 5-year-old emperor. Think of the bomb that went off by accident in a basement. Think of Sun Yat-sen reading the news in a Denver hotel room. History is rarely a grand, inevitable march of progress. More often, it's a series of whoops moments, accidental discoveries, and people trying to make the best of a situation they didn't see coming. The 20th century was done with dynasties. It was done with divine right. It wanted flags with stripes, constitutions with fine print, and leaders who at least pretended to listen to the people. China had changed its lock on the door, but it was still figuring out who held the keys. Rest easy, knowing that no matter how long the lease has been, there's always a chance for a renovation. The dragon is asleep, the Republic is awake, and the world is one step closer to the modern life we've been talking about. Tomorrow, we'll see how this modernization manifested in a much more violent way, as an Italian pilot decides that the best use for a grenade is to drop it out of a cockpit by hand. But for now, the Forbidden City is quiet. The crickets are in their cages, and 4,000 years of history have finally tucked themselves in for the night. Chapter 11. The First Aerial Bombardment. In the early months of 1911, the sky was still considered a sacred neutral territory. It was the realm of the clouds, the birds, and the occasional Victorian poet looking for a rhyme for azure. If you were a soldier on the ground, the sky was merely the place where the rain came from or where the sun sat while you went about the grim business of 19th century warfare, which mostly involved standing in a line and waiting for someone with a louder voice to tell you to move. But on November 1st, 1911, the sky lost its innocence. It didn't happen with a massive fleet of bombers or a high-tech laser. It happened because an Italian pilot named Giulio Gavotti decided to bring his work home with him. And by work, I mean 4 leather pouches full of explosives. And by home, I mean the unsuspecting Ottoman troops in Libya. The Italo-Turkish War, the conflict nobody asked for. To understand why an Italian was flying a plane over North Africa, we must look at the Italo-Turkish War. Italy, having arrived late to the Scramble for Africa dinner party, realized that all the good seats were taken. Britain had the lions, France had the wine, and Germany had the headache. Italy looked across the Mediterranean and saw Libya, which was then part of the crumbling Ottoman Empire. The Italians decided that Libya looked like a lovely place for a colony, or at the very least, a very large olive grove. They declared war on the Turks, sent over a fleet, and for the first time in history, brought along a newfangled toy called the airplane. At the time, the military viewed the airplane as a scouting tool. It was essentially a high-altitude tricycle that allowed a pilot to look down and say, "Yes, the enemy is definitely over there, and they look quite annoyed." Nobody had considered using it as a weapon of offense. To do so would have been considered unsportsmanlike, rather like bringing a crossbow to a chess match. Giulio Gavotti, the man with the lethal fruit. Lieutenant Giulio Gavotti was a man of vision, or perhaps just a man who was tired of just looking at things. On that fateful November morning, he climbed into his Electric Taube, a monoplane that looked remarkably like a giant motorized pigeon. The Taube was made of wood, canvas, and piano wire. It had no bomb bay, no targeting computer, and no seat belts. Gavotti, however, had a plan. He had packed 4 Cipelli grenades, small round explosives about the size of a large orange, into a leather pouch strapped to his thigh. His mission was a simple reconnaissance flight, but Gavotti had a flair for the dramatic. As he wobbled over the oasis of Ain Zara, he saw a camp of Ottoman soldiers. In a moment that would change the face of human conflict forever, he reached into his pouch, pulled out a grenade, and realized he had a logistical problem. The pin. In 1911, the height of military technology was a man trying to bite the pin out of a grenade while simultaneously trying not to crash a wooden bird into a sand dune. It was the birth of multitasking, and it was terrifying. Mark Twain. The logistics of the hand-dropped apocalypse. Gavotti didn't have a co-pilot. He had to fly the plane with one hand, hold the grenade with the other, and use his teeth to arm the device. Once the grenade was live, he didn't have a sophisticated drop mechanism. He simply leaned over the side of the cockpit, squinted at the ground several hundred feet below, and let go. He dropped 3 grenades on the oasis and 1 more on the camp at Tajira. The result was not a strategic masterpiece. He didn't wipe out the Ottoman army. He mostly just made some very loud noises and confused a few camels. But the psychological impact was immense. For the first time, death had arrived from a clear blue sky. There was no whistling of an incoming shell, no thunder of cavalry, just a man in a leather cap tossing oranges out of a window. Gavotti returned to his base, presumably expecting a stern talking-to for wasting company equipment. Instead, he became a global sensation. The headline screamed, "War from the Heavens," and "The Flying Death." The moral hangover. The international community's reaction was a mix of awe and wait. Can we do that? The Ottoman Empire immediately protested, claiming that dropping bombs from the air violated the Hague Convention of 1899, which prohibited the discharge of projectiles and explosives from balloons or by other new methods of a similar nature. The Italians, with the legal dexterity we've come to expect from 1911, argued that the convention only applied to balloons. And since an airplane was clearly not a balloon, it had a propeller and didn't look like a giant floating grape, they were technically in the clear. It was the ultimate 1911 loophole. We had invented a new way to kill each other faster than we had invented the laws to prevent it. Within months, every major power in Europe was looking at their scouting planes and wondering how many grenades they could fit in a leather pouch. The sky is now a parking lot. By the end of 1911, the tranquility of the sky was a thing of the past. We had turned the heavens into a battlefield. Gavotti's flight proved that the 20th century was going to be a place where distance no longer provided safety. If a man could fly a wooden pigeon over your house and drop a grenade on your breakfast, the world had suddenly become very small and very dangerous. We have spent thousands of years trying to get off the ground, and the very moment we succeeded, the first thing we did was look for someone to drop a rock on. Humanity is a species that can reach for the stars, but only if it can use them as ammunition. Mark Twain. The takeaway for the tucked in. As you settle into your pillow, listen to the silence of the night. Be thankful that the only things falling from the sky these days are raindrops or the occasional stray satellite. 1911 was the year the front line disappeared. War was no longer something that happened over there in a muddy field. It was something that could happen anywhere the wind blew. But for now, the Ettrick Taube is back in its hangar, the grenades are safely in their pouches, and Giulio Gavotti is probably trying to figure out how to get the taste of brass pins out of his mouth. The 20th century is getting louder. The engines are roaring, the bombs are falling, and the modern age is proving to be a very noisy neighbor. Rest easy, knowing that while the sky might be a battlefield tomorrow, tonight it's just a place for the moon to sit and watch us sleep. Tomorrow we head back across the Atlantic to Mexico, where a revolution is proving that you don't need a plane to have a very complicated year. But for now the sky is clear. The birds have reclaimed the clouds, and the oranges are just for eating. Chapter 12. Mexico's New Management. If 1911 was a year of evictions, then Mexico was the scene of the most complicated landlord-tenant dispute in the history of the Western Hemisphere. For over 30 years, the country had been managed by a man named Porfirio Diaz. He was a general, a dictator, and a man whose mustache was so structurally sound it could have supported a small suspension bridge. Under the Porfiriato, Mexico had experienced a strange, gilded sort of peace. Diaz believed in order and progress, which in 1911 terms meant that the railroads ran on time, the foreign investors were happy, and anyone who disagreed with the government was invited to a very long, very permanent vacation in a dusty basement. But by 1911, the order was starting to fray, and the progress had mostly resulted in Diaz owning a lot of very nice French furniture, while the rest of the country shared a single taco. The Mexican Revolution didn't start with a single explosion, it started with a book, a small man with a vegetarian diet, and the realization that being a dictator is a job that, much like being a milkman, becomes significantly harder once everyone starts using a refrigerator. The apostle of democracy and vegetables. The man who stepped up to challenge the iron-fisted Diaz was Francisco Madero. If you were casting a movie about a revolution, you would not cast Madero. He was short, had a high-pitched voice, was a strict vegetarian, and reportedly communicated with the spirit of his dead brother through a Ouija board to get political advice. In 1911, the Mexican people were faced with a choice between a man who had ruled with an iron fist for 30 years and a man who took his campaign strategy from a ghost. It was the birth of modern politics, choosing between the devil you know and the spirit you've never met. Mark Twain. Madero wrote a book called The Presidential Succession in 1910, which basically said, hey, maybe we should have an actual election where the winner isn't decided before the ballots are even printed. Diaz, in a display of confidence that borders on the hilarious, allowed Madero to run in the 1910 election. However, when it became clear that Madero was actually popular, Diaz did the most Dictator 101 thing possible. He threw Madero in jail and declared himself the winner by a landslide that would have made a Russian czar blush. The plan of San Luis Potosi. Madero, however, was a persistent little fellow. He escaped from prison, dressed, legend has it, as a railway worker, and fled to San Antonio, Texas. From the safety of the United States, the traditional home of people waiting for their neighbor's house to catch fire, he issued the plan of San Luis Potosi. He declared the 1910 election a fraud, named himself the provisional president, and called for a national uprising to begin at exactly 6 p.m. on November 20th, 1910. It's a rare thing in history for a revolution to have a scheduled start time, like a dental appointment or a theater performance. Most of Mexico missed the 6 p.m. deadline, but by early 1911, the message had finally sunk in. The country was on fire, and the man holding the match was a vegetarian who listened to spirits. The fall of the old guard. By the spring of 1911, the Porfiriato was collapsing like a cheap tent in a hurricane. Two names began to emerge from the chaos that would become the stuff of legend: Pascual Orozco and a former cattle rustler named Doroteo Arango, better known to history as Pancho Villa. Villa was the muscle of the revolution. He was a man who understood that if you want to change the government, you don't write a pamphlet. You steal a train and fill it with angry men with rifles. While Madero was busy being idealistic and spiritual, Villa and Orozco were busy taking Ciudad Juarez. The Battle of Ciudad Juarez in May 1911 was the turning point. It was fought right on the border of the United States. In fact, it was so close to the border that El Paso residents actually paid for tickets to sit on rooftops and watch the battle like it was a particularly violent Sunday matinee. When the city fell, Porfirio Diaz realized the game was up. He wasn't just losing a battle, he was losing his lease. On May 25, 1911, the man who had ruled Mexico for 34 years signed his resignation. The tiger and the train. Diaz left Mexico City under the cover of darkness, heading for the port of Veracruz. As he boarded the ship Ipiranga to head for exile in France, he allegedly turned to a reporter and uttered one of the most prophetic lines in history. "Madero has unleashed a tiger. Let us see if he can ride it." It was the ultimate "good luck, you'll need it" parting shot. Diaz knew that it was easy to get everyone to agree that they hated the landlord. It was much harder to get them to agree on how to fix the plumbing once he was gone. Madero entered Mexico City in June 1911 to a hero's welcome. There was an earthquake on the day he arrived, which the superstitious took as an omen. Madero, ever the optimist, probably thought the earth was just clapping. He was officially elected president in October 1911, marking the beginning of new management. The problem with being the good guy. Madero's presidency in late 1911 was a masterclass in the dangers of being a moderate in a room full of extremists. He wanted democracy, free speech, and fair elections. Unfortunately, the people who had fought the revolution wanted land. Specifically, they wanted the land that the rich friends of Diaz had stolen from them over the last 30 years. Emiliano Zapata, a man with a mustache that rivaled Diaz's and a much more focused agenda, approached Madero and basically said, "The democracy is nice, Francisco, but can we talk about the dirt?" When Madero told him to be patient and follow the law, Zapata issued the Plan of Ayala, effectively declaring war on Madero. By the end of 1911, Madero was in a precarious position. The old supporters of Diaz hated him because he was a revolutionary. The revolutionaries hated him because he wasn't revolutionary enough. He was a man trying to host a polite dinner party in the middle of a bar fight. The 1911 legacy, the revolving door of power. The events of 1911 in Mexico proved that the 20th century was going to be a time of unintended consequences. We had the technology to start a revolution, trains and telegraphs, but we didn't yet have the political software to manage the aftermath. Mexico had successfully evicted the landlord, but they had forgotten that once the landlord leaves, the building usually needs a complete structural overhaul. 1911 was the year the tiger was unleashed, and for the next decade, Mexico would be defined by the frantic, bloody attempt to find someone, anyone, who could stay in the saddle for more than a week. Mexico is a country where the only thing more dangerous than being the dictator is being the man who replaces him. It is a land of beautiful contradictions, where you can find God, you can find the United States, but you can almost never find a quiet place to take a nap. Mark Twain. The takeaway for the tucked in. As you settle into your blankets, consider the tiger of change. Think of the little vegetarian man who thought he could change a country with a book and a séance. History is often made by people who are brave enough to start something they don't know how to finish. 1911 was the year Mexico decided that order was no longer worth the price of freedom, even if that freedom came with a side of chaos and a decade of very loud arguments. The old general is on a ship to Paris. The new president is in the palace, listening to the floorboards creak, and Pancho Villa is somewhere in the desert, wondering if he left the oven on. Rest easy, knowing that your management is stable, your lease is secure, and you don't have to ride any tigers tonight. Tomorrow, we leave the heat of the Mexican desert for the literal ice of the South Pole, where Roald Amundsen and Robert Falcon Scott are about to have a very cold, very polite race to the bottom of the map. But for now, the revolution is resting, the mustache is groomed, and the tiger is purring for now. Chapter 13. Amundsen versus Scott, the frozen chess match. By the tail end of 1911, humanity had grown quite bored with the planet. We had mapped the jungles, cataloged the deserts, and even managed to find lost cities that had never actually been lost. The world was starting to feel a bit claustrophobic, like a house where all the furniture has been rearranged one too many times. There was only one blank spot left on the global bingo card, a place so inhospitable that even the most optimistic Victorian explorer looked at it and said, "Perhaps we should just stay home and have a nice cup of tea." That place was the South Pole. It was a geographical point of zero interest to anyone but mathematicians and penguins. Yet in 1911, it became the site of the most high-stakes, low-temperature chess match in human history. In one corner, we had Roald Amundsen, a Norwegian who treated exploration like a very cold, very serious plumbing contract. In the other, we had Captain Robert Falcon Scott, a British gentleman who treated exploration like a tragic opera that hadn't quite been written yet. The Great Polar Ghosting. The race began with a lie. Roald Amundsen had originally planned to go to the North Pole. He had the ship, he had the funding, and he had the blessing of the King of Norway. But then, two Americans, Peary and Cook, claimed they had already reached the North Pole. Now, a normal person would have unpacked their bags and looked for a hobby that didn't involve frostbite. But Amundsen was not a normal person. He decided that if he couldn't be first in the North, he would be first in the South. The problem was, he didn't tell anyone, not his crew, not his king, and certainly not Captain Scott, who was already on his way to Antarctica thinking he had the place to himself. It wasn't until his ship, the Fram, reached Madeira that Amundsen sent a telegram to Scott. It was the 1911 version of a "You up?" text, but significantly more devastating. Beg leave to inform you, Fram proceeding Antarctic. Amundsen. Roald Amundsen was the only man in history who could ghost an entire hemisphere. He told everyone he was going for a pack of cigarettes in the Arctic and ended up at the bottom of the world. It is the ultimate example of recalculating before GPS was invented. Mark Twain. Ancient wisdom versus modern hubris. The two expeditions arrived at the edge of the Antarctic ice within weeks of each other, but their approaches to the problem were as different as a Swiss watch and a grandfather clock that has been dropped down a flight of stairs. The Norwegian method. Fur and fangs. Amundsen's strategy was built on the radical idea of listening to people who actually live in the snow. He had spent years learning from the Inuit in the Arctic. He didn't wear British wool. He wore Inuit furs. He didn't use complicated technology. He used skis and dogs. Amundsen brought 52 Greenland Huskies. His plan was a masterpiece of grim, efficient logistics. The dogs would pull the sleds. As the loads got lighter and the journey got harder, the extra dogs would be, they would be converted into fuel for the remaining dogs and the men. It was a self-cleaning, self-propelled, and, depending on your perspective, horrifically delicious logistics chain. The British method, ponies and pistons. Captain Scott, meanwhile, was a man of the Edwardian era. He believed that the British Empire was destined to conquer nature through sheer force of character and a variety of experimental gadgets. Scott's modern hubris manifested in three ways. Motorized sleds. He brought 3 motor-driven, tracked vehicles. They were the ancestors of the snowmobile, but with the reliability of a chocolate teapot. 2 of them fell through the ice almost immediately, and the third broke down after a few miles. Siberian ponies. Scott decided that ponies were more noble than dogs. Unfortunately, ponies are also incredibly heavy, have thin legs that sink into the snow like needles into a cake, and, most crucially, they don't eat other ponies. They require tons of bulky fodder. Human power. Scott had a romantic, almost mystical belief in man-hauling. He believed that there was something morally superior about British sailors straining against harness ropes to pull a 1,000-pound sled. Scott brought ponies to the South Pole. This is roughly equivalent to bringing a lawn mower to a volcanic eruption. It was a lovely sentiment, But nature does not care about your sentiment. Nature only cares if you have four-wheel drive and a thick coat of blubber. Mark Twain. Framheim versus Cape Evans. The two camps were set up about 400 miles apart. Amundsen set up at Framheim on the Great Ice Barrier, while Scott settled at Cape Evans. Amundsen spent the winter of 1911 like a man preparing for a bank heist. He and his men lived in an underground network of caves carved into the ice. They obsessed over their gear. They redesigned their sleds to be lighter. They repacked their food. They practiced skiing until they could do it in their sleep. Amundsen even insisted that every man have a custom-fitted set of boots, because he knew that a single blister in Antarctica was a death sentence. Over at Scott's camp, things were a bit more academic. Scott's expedition was a scientific mission. They spent the winter collecting emperor penguin eggs, measuring magnetism, and writing very long, very depressing journals about how much they missed the color green. While Amundsen was sharpening his knives, Scott was sharpening his metaphors. The opening moves. The actual race to the pole began in the spring of 1911. Amundsen started first, but he started too early. The temperature was still minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The dog's paws were freezing, and the men's breath was turning into ice daggers. Realizing he had made a rookie mistake, Amundsen did something Scott would never do. He retreated. He went back to base camp, waited for the sun to actually do its job, and started again in October. When he set off for the second time, he was a machine. He and his four companions and the dogs covered 20 miles a day. They treated the Antarctic plateau like a cross-country ski race. They left depots of food every 60 miles, marking them with giant flags and piles of snow so they couldn't miss them on the way back. Scott, meanwhile, was struggling. The motor sleds were gone. The ponies were dying one by one, their legs failing them in the deep drifts. Scott's men had to shoot the ponies and then take over the pulling themselves. They were man-hauling through the most brutal terrain on Earth, burning 6,000 calories a day and eating only 4,000. They were essentially digesting themselves as they walked. The plateau of despair. By December 1911, Amundsen had reached the polar plateau. He had climbed the Axel Heiberg Glacier, a feat of navigation that should have been impossible. He was only a few hundred miles from the prize. He was fast, he was healthy, and he was, to his surprise, actually enjoying the scenery. Scott was hundreds of miles behind, buried in a blizzard, his men exhausted and suffering from the early stages of scurvy. He was still writing in his journal, still hoping that British grit would somehow overcome the fact that he was trying to walk across a continent of ice with nothing but a pair of boots and a very heavy sled. The frozen chess match was coming to an end. Amundsen had played the game with the cold efficiency of a grandmaster who knows his opponent's clock is about to run out. Scott was playing a game of checkers on a board that was currently being tossed into a wood chipper. The takeaway for the tucked in. As you settle into your warm bed, consider the difference between expertise and effort. Roald Amundsen reached the pole because he was humble enough to learn from the people who knew the snow. He didn't try to reinvent the wheel, he just put a better dog in front of it. Captain Scott, for all his bravery, was a victim of his own era, a man who believed that the more you suffered, the more noble the victory would be. History, however, does not give out trophies for suffering. It gives out trophies for arriving. As the wind howls outside, or just your air conditioner, think of the quiet, rhythmic swish-swish of Amundsen's skis on the ice. Think of the dogs, dreaming of seal meat and endless running. The South Pole is waiting, and the Norwegian flag is already in the bag. Rest easy, knowing that your logistics are sound and your man-hauling is limited to pulling the duvet over your shoulders. Tomorrow, we'll see what Amundsen found at the bottom of the world, and the polite note he left for the man who was still struggling through the snow. But for now, the ice is silent. The chess match is nearly over, and the black dot at the bottom of the map is about to get a name. Chapter 14. The Norwegian Flag at 90 degrees south. On December 14, 1911, the bottom of the world finally ran out of south. For centuries, the South Pole had been a mythical abstraction, a mathematical ghost that existed only to make maps look tidy. But on this crisp, unimaginably cold Friday afternoon, 4 men and a pack of very tired dogs realized that no matter which way they turned, they were facing north. Roald Amundsen had done it. He had navigated 3,000 miles of frozen ocean, climbed glaciers that looked like the teeth of a cosmic giant, and crossed a plateau that was essentially a white desert at 10,000 feet of elevation. And he had done it all with the calm, methodical efficiency of a man who was just trying to finish his chores before the sun went down for 6 months. The precision of the frozen compass. Navigating to the South Pole in 1911 was not a matter of following a trail or checking a phone. It was a high-stakes geometry exam conducted in a freezer. As Amundsen and his 4 companions, Olav Bjaaland, Helmer Hansen, Sverre Hassel, and Oscar Wisting, drew closer to the prize, they became obsessed with the numbers. They weren't just looking for the pole. They were looking for 90 degrees 0 minutes south. If they missed it by a mile, the British would claim they had wandered aimlessly in the vicinity, which is the Victorian diplomatic term for losers. To ensure they actually stood on the spot, Amundsen didn't just plant a flag and go home. He sent 3 of his men out in different directions, 10 miles out, like the spokes of a wheel, just to make sure they boxed in the pole. He was a man who understood that history is written by the people who have the best receipts. At approximately 3 p.m., they halted. They checked their sextants. They checked their chronometers. They looked at each other with the weary, wind-burned expressions of men who had spent the last 90 days staring at the back of a dog. There is a great deal of poetry written about discovering the pole, but at the moment of arrival, most of it is just 5 men standing in a circle, breathing heavily and realizing that the scenery hasn't changed in 400 miles. Mark Twain. The ceremony of the silken flag. The actual planting of the flag was a curiously quiet affair. There were no brass bands, no speeches, and no champagne, mostly because the champagne would have been a solid block of ice that could be used as a blunt force weapon. All 5 men together grasped the pole of the Norwegian flag and drove it into the ice. Amundsen, in a rare moment of sentimentality, named the spot Polheim, home of the pole, and the surrounding plateau King Haakon VII's Plateau. They stayed for 3 days. They took more measurements. They slept. They ate extra rations of pemmican, a delightful mixture of dried meat, fat, and despair. And most importantly, they smoked their pipes. In the world of 1911, no victory was official until you had successfully set fire to a small amount of tobacco inside a wooden bowl. The ultimate Antarctic Postal Service. Before leaving, Amundsen performed the most audacious, polite, and psychologically devastating move in the history of exploration. He left a tent. Inside the tent, he left a small collection of items. A letter to King Haakon VII, just in case Amundsen didn't make it back. He wanted the king to know he'd won. A short note for Captain Robert Falcon Scott. The note for Scott was a masterpiece of Norwegian understatement. It basically said, "Dear Scott, I've been here. It was lovely. Please take this letter to the king for me if you happen to find it. Best of luck on the walk back. Cheers, Roald." Imagine being Scott. Imagine slogging through the snow, man-hauling a 1,000-pound sled, suffering from scurvy and frostbite, fueled by the hope that you might be the first person in history to stand at the bottom of the world, only to arrive and find a pre-built tent and a to-do list left by the guy who beat you there a month ago. It is one thing to lose a race. It is quite another to realize that your opponent has turned you into his personal mail carrier. Amundsen didn't just win, he outsourced his administrative tasks to the second-place finisher, Mark Twain. The return, a sled ride to glory. On December 17th, the Norwegians turned around. If the journey to the pole was a grueling climb, the journey back was a victory lap on skis. Amundsen had laid out his supply depots with such mathematical precision that they never went hungry. In fact, because they had fewer dogs to feed, for reasons we discussed in the last chapter, the men actually gained weight on the return journey. They were traveling 30 miles a day. They were skimming over the ice, the wind at their backs, laughing as they flew down the glaciers they had struggled to climb weeks before. They reached their base camp at Framheim on January 25th, 1912. The entire journey had taken 99 days. They had covered 1,860 miles. They were healthy, they were successful, and they had arguably the best "what I did this summer" story in the history of the human race. The professional versus the romantic. The success of the 1911 Norwegian expedition is often criticized as being boring. There were no harrowing escapes from ice chasms, no desperate battles with starvation, and no tragic final letters home. But as Amundsen himself said, victory awaits him who has everything in order. Luck, people call it. Defeat is certain for him who has neglected to take the necessary precautions in time. This is called bad luck. Amundsen proved that in 1911, the modern age was about preparation. The era of the gallant amateur who hoped for the best was ending. The era of the professional who planned for the worst was beginning. Amundsen won because he treated the South Pole like a job. He didn't want to be a hero. He wanted to be an achiever. He didn't want to suffer for his country. He wanted to come home and have a beer in his country. And in the hilariously pragmatic world of 1911, that was the greatest innovation of all. The takeaway for the tucked in. As you settle into your blankets, Think of the Polheim tent sitting alone in the middle of a white infinity. Think of the Norwegian flag flapping in a wind that has no name. 1911 was the year we finished the map. We had reached the top and the bottom. There were no more great unknowns left on the surface of the earth. We were now a species that knew exactly where we were, even if we weren't entirely sure what we were going to do now that we'd arrived. Rest easy, knowing that your depots, the kitchen, are well stocked, and your navigation, the hallway, is simple. You don't have to leave a note for anyone tonight, and you certainly don't have to carry anyone else's mail. The ice is silent. The Norwegians are home, and the South Pole is officially open for business. Tomorrow, we'll look at the price of second place. We'll see what happened to Captain Scott as he arrived at that lonely tent and realized that the modern world had moved faster than he ever thought possible. It's a somber tale, but one that reminds us that in the race of life, it's always better to bring the dogs. Chapter 15. The Price of Second Place. If history were a polite dinner party, Roald Amundsen would be the guest who arrived exactly on time, ate a sensible meal, and left before anyone had to worry about the coat rack. Captain Robert Falcon Scott, however, was the guest who got lost on the way, arrived just as the host was putting on his pajamas, and then proceeded to have a very public, very poetic, existential crisis in the driveway. In the previous chapter, we saw the Norwegian flag dancing at 90 degrees south. Today, we must look at the men who arrived 34 days later. Because in the high-stakes world of 1911, exploration, being the second person to stand at the bottom of the world, is a special kind of agony. It's like running a marathon, only to find that the finish line has been replaced by a closed for maintenance sign and a half-eaten sandwich. The sight of the black flag. On January 16, 1912, Scott and his four companions, Wilson, Bowers, Oates, and Evans, were struggling across the final miles of the Antarctic plateau. They were exhausted, they were hungry, and they were fueled by the desperate, flickering hope that the tracks they had seen earlier were just a very organized group of penguins. Then they saw it, a black speck against the infinite white. It wasn't a rock, it wasn't a mirage, it was a black flag tied to a sled runner. Nearby was the Polheim tent, looking sturdy, smug, and suspiciously well ventilated. Scott's journal entry for that day is a master class in British understatement and profound disappointment. The worst has happened, or nearly the worst. All the daydreams must go. It will be a wearisome return. Imagine the scene. 5 men who have spent months man-hauling nearly 1,000 pounds of gear across a frozen hellscape, believing they are the vanguard of the British Empire, only to find a Norwegian to-do list and a note asking them to check the mail. It was the ultimate 1911 participation trophy, except the trophy was made of ice and came with a side of frostbite. The 35-pound scientific distraction. Now, at this point, any sensible person would have looked at the Norwegian flag, uttered a few choice words that the Royal Navy usually reserves for bad rum, and immediately turned around to run for the coast. But Scott was a man of the heroic age. He decided that if he couldn't be the first to reach the pole, he would at least be the most thorough scientist to ever freeze to death. On the way back, despite their dwindling rations and failing health, The party stopped at Mount Darwin to collect geological samples. They gathered 35 pounds of fossils. Think about that for a moment. They were starving. Their feet were rotting. They were man-hauling their own sleds because the ponies were dead and the motors were scrap metal. And yet, they decided to add the weight of a medium-sized dog in rocks to their load because they wanted to prove that Antarctica used to have trees. There is something uniquely British about refusing to save your own life because you haven't finished your rock collection. It is the height of progress in 1911, dying with the correct data in your pockets. Mark Twain. The long, slow fade. The return journey from the pole was a slow-motion tragedy written in the snow. The weather in early 1912 was uncharacteristically brutal, even for Antarctica. Temperatures plummeted to minus 40 degrees Celsius and stayed there. First, they lost Edgar Evans. Evans was the strong man of the group, a massive sailor who was supposed to be the engine of the sled. But the Antarctic doesn't care about your bicep measurements. Evans suffered a concussion from a fall and slowly drifted into a stupor, eventually passing away at the foot of the Beardmore Glacier. Then came the tragedy of Captain Lawrence Oates. Oates was suffering from severe frostbite. His feet were turning into something that resembled wet charcoal. He realized he was slowing the others down. On his 32nd birthday, as a blizzard raged outside their tent, Oates stood up and uttered the most famous parting line in the history of the English language. "I am just going outside and maybe some time." He walked out into the white nothingness to save his friends. It was a gesture of incredible nobility, a moment where the heroic age reached its peak. Sadly, in the cold accounting of 1911, his sacrifice wasn't enough. The tiger of the Antarctic was already mid-leap. The 11-mile gap. By late March, the remaining three, Scott, Wilson, and Bowers, were trapped in their tent by a relentless blizzard. They were only 11 miles from One Ton Depot, a massive cache of food and fuel that would have saved their lives. 11 miles. In a modern car, that's a 15-minute drive. For a fit person, it's a 3-hour walk. For 3 men starving to death in a frozen tent, it was the distance to the moon. Scott spent his final days writing. He wrote letters to the mothers of his men, letters to his wife, and a message to the public. He didn't write about his mistakes in logistics or his refusal to use dogs. He wrote about grit. He wrote about the hardihood of the British race. He turned a logistical failure into a moral victory. When the search party found the tent 8 months later, they found the journals, the fossils, and the bodies. They also found that Scott had died last, his arm thrown over his best friend Wilson. The legacy of the heroic failure. The world's reaction to the news in 1913 was fascinating. Roald Amundsen, the man who actually won, was respected, but largely viewed as a lucky professional. Captain Scott, the man who lost and died, became a global saint. 1911 was the year we decided that how you fail is sometimes more important than whether you succeed. We loved Scott because he suffered beautifully. We loved him because he died for a scientific mission while carrying 35 pounds of rocks. In the 20th century, we would learn to value efficiency, but in 1911, we still valued the tragedy. We preferred the man who froze with a pen in his hand over the man who skied home with a smile on his face. It's a habit we haven't quite managed to kick. Mark Twain, the takeaway for the tucked in. As you settle into the safety of your blankets, take a moment to appreciate the 11 miles. Appreciate the fact that your depots are in the kitchen and your science is likely just checking the weather on your phone. The race for the South Pole was the final act of a certain kind of human history. It was the moment where modern planning, Amundsen, finally evicted romantic bravery, Scott. We were moving into a world where it wasn't enough to be a hero. You had to be a manager. Rest easy, knowing that second place in your life usually just means getting a silver medal or a slightly smaller slice of cake. You don't have to carry any fossils tonight, and you certainly don't have to go outside for some time. The blizzard is silent. The tent is still. And the fossils are finally back in the museum where they belong. Tomorrow, we leave the ice for the laboratory once more, this time to look at Crisco, the lab-grown lard that proved that by 1911 we were ready to start eating science for breakfast. But for now, the map is finished, the pole is found, and the heroes are at rest. Chapter 16. Crisco, the lab-grown lard. By the summer of 1911, the 20th century had already proven it could conquer the map, the atom, and the empty space on a museum wall. But there was one final frontier that remained stubbornly stuck in the 19th century: the American frying pan. For generations, the kitchen had been a place of heavy, animal-based reality. If you wanted to fry a chicken or bake a pie that didn't have the structural integrity of a wet napkin, you reached for lard. Lard was honest. Lard was simple. Lard was the rendered fat of a pig that had spent its life preparing for the singular honor of making your biscuits flaky. If you were feeling particularly wealthy or European, you used butter, which was essentially sunshine filtered through a cow and churned until it gave up. But in August 1911, a company called Procter & Gamble decided that the pig was an inefficient middleman. They realized that the modern age shouldn't rely on the biological whims of livestock. They wanted a fat that was born in a test tube, raised in a factory, and possessed the shelf life of a granite tombstone. Enter Crisco, the crystallized cottonseed oil. It was the moment humanity decided that progress didn't just mean flying across the country, it meant eating a science experiment for breakfast. The Great Cottonseed Conundrum. To understand Crisco, we must first look at the cotton gin. Throughout the 1800s, the American South produced mountains of cotton, which left behind oceans of cottonseed. For decades, cottonseed was considered industrial trash. It was the rubbish of the textile industry. Farmers would dump it into rivers, where it would rot and create a stench that could peel the paint off a barn, or they would leave it in massive, smoldering piles. By the late 1800s, clever businessmen realized that if you crushed the seeds, you got a yellow oil. They tried using it for lamps, too smoky, for lubrication, too sticky, and eventually as a filler to secretly stretch out expensive lard, a practice that led to some very angry lawsuits and the eventual realization that Americans didn't like their pig fat tainted with plant sweat. But then, the landlord of the 20th century, chemistry, stepped in. The German chemist and the hydrogen hack. In the early 1900s, a German chemist named E.C. Kaiser walked into the Procter & Gamble offices in Cincinnati with a secret. He had discovered a process called hydrogenation. Essentially, Kaiser took liquid cottonseed oil, heated it up, added a bit of nickel as a catalyst, and started pumping in hydrogen gas, H2. This process forced the liquid fat molecules to straighten out and pack together tightly. The result was a miracle of 1911 alchemy, a liquid vegetable oil that had been magically transformed into a solid, white, odorless fat. It looked like lard. It acted like lard. But it had never been within 100 miles of a pig's snout. Hydrogenation was the ultimate 1911 trick. It took a waste product that smelled like a swamp and turned it into a substance so pure and white that it looked like it had been harvested from a cloud. It was the birth of synthetic reality in the kitchen. Mark Twain. The naming of the beast. Procter & Gamble originally wanted to call their new creation Crispo. They liked the way it sounded, clean, crunchy, and vaguely like a threat. But they ran into trademark issues. They then considered Crist, short for crystallized. But someone in the marketing department pointed out that naming a cooking fat after the Messiah might be a bit on the nose for the Midwestern market. Finally, they settled on Crisco. It was a nonsense word, but in 1911, nonsense words were the height of corporate sophistication. Crisco sounded technical, yet domestic. It sounded like something that belonged in a laboratory but wouldn't mind helping out with the Sunday roast. The marketing masterclass, selling purity. In 1911, P&G didn't just launch a product, they launched a psychological campaign. They knew they had a problem. They were asking Americans to stop using the fat they'd used for 3,000 years and start using hardened industrial seed oil. Their solution was a stroke of genius. They didn't focus on what Crisco was. They focused on what it wasn't. It wasn't animal. They marketed it as purely vegetable. In an era of rising concerns about food safety, thanks to the muckrakers like Upton Sinclair, the idea of a fat that didn't come from a messy, germ-ridden slaughterhouse was incredibly appealing. It was scientific. They showed pictures of men in white lab coats holding beakers of Crisco. They told housewives that Crisco was digested more easily than lard, a claim based on absolutely nothing but the confidence of the 1911 advertising executive. It was white. In 1911, whiteness was a proxy for cleanliness. Because Crisco was chemically bleached and refined to a snowy brilliance, it made lard look gray and suspicious. They sent out the Crisco Cookbook, featuring 615 recipes that all, conveniently, required a massive amount of Crisco. They gave away free samples to domestic science teachers. They essentially colonized the American brain before the first pie was even out of the oven. The invisible ingredient, trans fats. Of course, in 1911, we didn't know about the tiger hiding in the Crisco tin. The process of partial hydrogenation created trans fats. To the people of 1911, trans fats were a miracle. They allowed the fat to stay solid at room temperature and prevented it from going rancid. You could leave a can of Crisco in a hot pantry for 3 years, and it would emerge looking just as white and hopeful as the day it was born. We didn't realize that these straightened molecules were also incredibly difficult for the human heart to deal with. We were effectively plasticizing our arteries in the name of a fluffier pie crust. But that was a problem for the 21st century. In 1911, we were just happy that our fried chicken didn't smell like a barnyard. Crisco was the first time we invited the factory to live in our stomachs. We traded the uncertainty of nature for the certainty of the machine, and we thought we had struck a marvelous bargain. It turns out the machine is a very demanding houseguest. Mark Twain. The Great Displacement. The arrival of Crisco marked the beginning of the end for the old world of food. Within a decade, large sales plummeted. The pig, once the king of the American farm, was relegated to the bacon-only division. It also changed the way we thought about waste. 1911 was the year we realized that there is no such thing as trash. There is only inventory that hasn't been marketed yet. If you have enough chemistry and a good enough slogan, you can sell anything to anyone, provided you make it white enough and put it in a pretty blue tin. Crisco was the pioneer of the processed food revolution. It paved the way for margarine, for TV dinners, and for the era of food-like substances that line our grocery stores today. It was the moment we decided that we were smarter than the cow and more efficient than the hog. The takeaway for the tucked in. As you settle into your pillow, think of the hydrogenation miracle. Think of the tiny bubbles of gas turning a liquid waste product into a solid white cream. 1911 was the year our kitchens joined the Industrial Revolution. We were no longer just cooking, we were processing. We were taking the raw materials of the earth and improving them until they were unrecognizable. Rest easy, knowing that your dinner is hopefully not made of 100% hardened cottonseed oil. But even if it is, take comfort in the fact that your pie crust is likely very, very flaky. The lab is dark. The nickel catalyst has been put away. The white clouds of Crisco are cooling in their tins, and the American pig is finally getting a night off. Tomorrow, we move from the modernity of the kitchen to the brutality of the factory floor. We'll look at the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, a tragedy that reminded us that while progress can be white and pure, it often comes at a price that can't be measured in tins or dividends. But for now, the oil is still, the chemistry is quiet, and the 20th century is delicious, at least on the surface. Chapter 17. The Birth of IBM, the Tabulating Giant. By the middle of 1911, the world was already quite crowded with things that moved, things that exploded, and things that were chemically hardened into pie crusts. But as the pace of life accelerated to the blistering speed of a Chevrolet on a brick road, a new problem began to emerge. A problem that couldn't be solved with a wrench or a holster. That problem was arithmetic. Humanity had reached a point where we were producing more stuff, more people, and more money than our poor primate brains could keep track of. We were drowning in a sea of ledger books, and the 20th century was threatening to stall out simply because nobody could remember where they had put the decimal point. On June 16, 1911, a man named Charles Flint, a financier known as the father of trusts for his habit of duct taping smaller companies together until they became monopolies, decided to perform a strange piece of corporate surgery. He took three companies that seemingly had nothing in common and fused them into a single three-headed beast called the Computing Tabulating Recording Company, or CTR. To the average person in 1911, CTR sounded like the most boring organization ever conceived by man. It sounded like a place where fun went to be filed away in a gray cabinet. But in reality, it was the birth of the information age. It was the grandfather of IBM, the three faces of the machine. To understand the absurdity of CTR, you have to look at its constituent parts. It was as if a mad scientist had decided to build a person out of a clock, a scale, and a piece of Swiss cheese. 1. The Time Clocks, International Time Recording Company. Before 1911, time was a somewhat fluid concept. You showed up for work when the sun was up, and you left when the foreman looked tired. But CTR's time recording division changed all that. They sold the time clock. Suddenly, your relationship with your employer was moderated by a mechanical punch. You weren't a craftsman or a person. You were a series of ink stamps on a card. It was the birth of the 9-to-5 soul-crushing efficiency that we all know and love today. 2. The Computing Scales, Computing Scale Company of America. This division made scales that didn't just tell you how much a pound of ham weighed, they told you how much it cost. It was a machine designed to ensure that neither the butcher nor the housewife could cheat the other by more than a fraction of a cent. It was computing in its most literal meat-based form. 3. The Punch Cards, the Tabulating Machine Company. This was the real brain of the operation, founded by a man named Herman Hollerith. Hollerith was a man who hated the census. In 1880, it had taken the U.S. government 8 years to count everyone, which meant by the time they finished, the data was already 10 years old, and half the people they counted were either moved or dead. Hollerith looked at the way a player piano used rolls of paper with holes in them to play music and thought, why can't I do that with people? He invented a system where a person's entire life, age, sex, occupation, number of children, was reduced to a series of holes in a rectangular piece of cardstock. His machines could read these cards by passing them over needles that completed an electrical circuit through the holes. Herman Hollerith was the man who realized that if you want to manage 1 billion people, you first have to turn them into a piece of Swiss cheese. He turned the human soul into a binary code of whole or no hole, and the world has never been the same since. Mark Twain. Charles Flint, the corporate matchmaker. Charles Flint was a man who didn't care about clocks or scales or holes in paper. He cared about synergy, a word that in 1911 meant, I am going to make a lot of money by firing half the janitors. Flint saw that the world was becoming a big system. Railroads needed to track cargo. Governments needed to track citizens. Insurance companies needed to track the probability of you slipping on a banana peel. All of these required data processing. By merging these three companies, Flint created a one-stop shop for the modern manager. If you were a tycoon in 1911, you could buy your time clocks from CTR to watch your workers, your scales to watch your inventory, and your tabulating machines to watch your profits. It was the ultimate invisible landlord. CTR didn't make anything you could eat or wear. It made the efficiency that allowed everyone else to make those things. The missing ingredient, Thomas J. Watson. While CTR was formed in 1911, it was initially a bit of a mess. It was three companies that didn't really like each other, being managed by a man, Flint, who was more interested in his yacht than in punch cards. The company wouldn't truly become the giant we know today until a few years later, when a man named Thomas J. Watson arrived. Watson had just been fired from the National Cash Register Company, another bastion of 1911 politeness, and he brought with him a single, devastatingly simple idea. He didn't want to sell machines. He wanted to sell culture. He put the word think on every wall. He made his salesmen wear dark suits and white shirts, turning them into a corporate priesthood. But the foundation was laid in 1911. Without the merger of the clock, the scale, and the card, Watson would have had nothing to think about. The binary prophecy. The birth of CTR in 1911 was the moment humanity officially gave up on being messy. We decided that the only way to survive the 20th century was to turn everything into a number. Standard Oil, Chapter 2, was about the energy that moved the world. Chevrolet, Chapter 6, was about the freedom to travel the world. CTR was about the data that measured the world. Of the three, the data proved to be the most powerful. You can run out of oil and you can crash a car, but you can never, ever run out of things to count. By the end of the year, CTR was quietly humming along in the background of the American economy. While the headlines were full of missing paintings and South Pole races, the punch card machines were quietly clicking away, turning the 20th century into a series of electrical pulses. We used to be a species that told stories around a fire. In 1911, we became a species that fed cards into a box. It's a much faster way to live, but I've yet to find a punch card that can tell a decent joke or enjoy a good cigar. Mark Twain. The takeaway for the tucked in. As you settle into your pillow, think of the tabulating giant. Think of the millions of little holes in millions of little cards, each one representing a person, a price, or a second of time. We live in the world that CTR built. Every time you look at a spreadsheet, scan a barcode, or check the clock on your phone, you are participating in the legacy of 1911. We are the descendants of the punch card, living in a world where efficiency is the only god that never takes a day off. Rest easy, knowing that for tonight you are off the clock. Your data is safe, your weight is irrelevant, and nobody is going to punch your card for at least another 8 hours. The machines have finished their counting. The vacuum tubes, which are still a few years away, but the idea is there, are cooling down. And the world of binary is waiting for the sun to come up. Tomorrow, we move from the clinical efficiency of the office to the tragic reality of the factory. We'll look at the triangle shirtwaist fire, the moment where the modern world was forced to realize that if you treat people like punch cards, eventually the system is going to burn down. But for now, the ledger is balanced. The clock has struck 12, and the 20th century is precisely where it's supposed to be. Chapter 18. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. By the spring of 1911, the American dream had successfully moved indoors. We had traded the unpredictable chaos of the farm, where a rogue cow or a late frost could ruin your year, for the predictable mechanical hum of the factory. We believed that by putting a roof over our heads and a clock on the wall, we had finally tamed the tiger of existence. But on March 25th, 1911, the city of New York was forced to realize that the modern life we had built was essentially a gilded furnace. While we were busy celebrating the efficiency of the punch card and the purity of lab-grown lard, we had forgotten one minor detail. Human beings are not made of cast iron, and they don't respond well to being locked inside a burning building. This is the story of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, a tragedy so profound that it managed to do the impossible. It made the Gilded Age grow a conscience. The iPhone of 1911, the shirtwaist. Before we get to the fire, we must discuss the shirtwaist. If you were a woman in 1911, the shirtwaist was your entire identity. It was a high-necked button-down blouse that gave women a professional silhouette while still allowing them to look like they were ready to lead a suffrage march or bake a very complicated cake. It was the first mass-produced garment in history. It was the uniform of the new working woman, the shop girls, the stenographers, and the factory workers. Because everyone wanted one, the factories in New York were running 24 hours a day, turning out thousands of these lace-trimmed garments for the hungry wardrobes of the American middle class. At the top of this fashion empire sat Max Blank and Isaac Harris, known as the Shirtwaist Kings. They operated the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory on the top 3 floors of the Ash Building in Manhattan. They were men of progress. They had electric sewing machines that could stitch faster than the eye could follow. They had a system of efficiency that would have made the boys at IBM, Chapter 17, weep with joy. But their efficiency had a very dark, very wooden foundation. The fortress of efficiency. The Triangle Factory was on paper a marvel. It was fireproof, a term that in 1911 meant the walls won't burn, but everything inside them is basically kindling. The factory floors were packed with hundreds of young immigrant women, mostly teenagers from Italy and Eastern Europe, who spoke very little English, but understood the language of the sewing machine perfectly. Blank and Harris had a few innovations to ensure maximum productivity. The locked door, to prevent the girls from slipping out for an unauthorized break or, heaven forbid, stealing a scrap of lace. The exit doors to the stairwells were kept locked from the outside. The scrap piles. Because stopping to clean up cost money, the floors were covered in piles of highly flammable cotton scraps and tissue paper patterns. The single fire escape. There was one fire escape for the entire building. It was a spindly iron contraption that looked like it had been designed by someone who hated the concept of gravity. In 1911, safety was viewed as an unnecessary luxury like caviar or a comfortable pair of boots. The bosses believed that if you were busy working, you didn't have time to be on fire. It was a bold theory that ignored the basic laws of thermodynamics. Mark Twain. The spark in the scrap bin. At 4:40 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon, just as the workers were preparing to collect their meager paychecks and head home, a fire started in a scrap bin on the 8th floor. Someone likely dropped a match or a cigarette, a habit that Buck Duke, Chapter 3, had spent millions encouraging, though usually not in a room full of cotton. The fire spread with a speed that defied belief. Within minutes, the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors were a vortex of flame. The workers on the 8th floor managed to escape via the elevators and the one unlocked door. The workers on the 10th floor, where the bosses had their offices, escaped to the roof and climbed to safety on an adjacent building. But the workers on the 9th floor were trapped. They ran to the exit doors, only to find them locked. They ran to the single fire escape, but it buckled under the heat and the weight, collapsing into a heap of twisted iron and sending dozens of women to the pavement below. The elevators ran as long as they could. The operators were the true heroes of the day, making trip after trip through the smoke, until the heat warped the tracks and the cars couldn't move. In full view of thousands of New Yorkers who had gathered on the street below, 146 people died. Most were young women between the ages of 14 and 23. It was a tragedy of such mechanical and human failure that the city went into a state of collective shock. The trial of the Shirtwaist Kings. If the fire was a tragedy, the aftermath was a masterclass in 1911-style justice. Blank and Harris were put on trial for manslaughter. Their defense attorney, Max Stoyer, was one of the cleverest men in New York. He didn't try to argue that the doors weren't locked. He simply argued that the bosses didn't know they were locked on that specific day. He cross-examined the survivors with a brutality that would be illegal today, making them repeat their stories until they were confused and then accusing them of memorizing a script. The jury, composed entirely of men, because, as we've established, 1911 was still a bit rough around the edges of equality, found Blank and Harris not guilty. The irony was finalized 3 years later, when a civil court ordered the owners to pay $75 for each life lost. To add the final bitter cherry on top of this legal sundae, the insurance companies had already paid Blank and Harris roughly $400 per victim. The Shirtwaist Kings made a profit of over $300 per dead girl. It was the most successful business transaction of their careers. It proved that, in 1911, the only thing cheaper than a shirtwaist was the life of the person who made it, Mark Twain. The birth of the brick in the hand. But New York was not going to let this go. The fire became the fuel for the labor movement. A young woman named Frances Perkins happened to be at a nearby townhouse having tea when the fire broke out. She watched the women jump from the windows. She never forgot it. She went on to become the head of the Committee on Public Safety and eventually the first female U.S. Secretary of Labor under FDR. The Triangle Fire led to the creation of the Factory Investigating Commission, which resulted in the passage of over 30 new laws in New York. These laws mandated fire extinguishers, automatic sprinklers, fire drills, and, most importantly, the requirement that doors must open outward and never be locked during work hours. The modern life had been forced to look at its own reflection and didn't like what it saw. We realized that progress was a lie if the fire escapes were made of hope and the exit doors were held shut by greed. The 1911 verdict. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire was the moment the 20th century grew up. We stopped believing that the system would take care of itself. We realized that if we were going to build giant cities and massive factories, we needed more than just punch cards and oil. We needed human rights. It was the year the labor movement stopped asking for safety and started demanding it with a brick in its hand and a vote in its pocket. By the end of 1911, the Ash Building was still standing, but the world inside it had changed forever. We were no longer willing to be the fuel for the industrial machine. We wanted to be the operators. The takeaway for the tucked in. As you settle into the safety of your home, take a moment to look at the exit signs in your life. Appreciate the doors that open outward and the sprinklers hidden in the ceiling. 1911 was the year we learned that efficiency without empathy is just a high-speed way to have a disaster. We are the beneficiaries of a tragedy that happened over a century ago. A reminder that the modern world was built on the backs and the sacrifices of people who just wanted a better life and a clean shirtwaist. Rest easy, knowing that your bosses are far away, your doors are unlocked, and the only fire in your life is the warm glow of your dreams. The sewing machines have stopped, the smoke has cleared, and the shirtwaist kings have faded into the dusty corners of history, leaving behind a world that finally knows how to open a door. Tomorrow, we move to a much quieter building, the New York Public Library, where two lions named Patience and Fortitude are waiting to show us that while factories can burn, knowledge is forever. But for now, the city is quiet. The streets of Manhattan are still, and the 20th century is finally starting to listen. Chapter 19. The New York Public Library opens. By May of 1911, the city of New York was, by all accounts, a sensory assault. It was a place where the air was thick with the scent of roasted chestnuts, horse manure, and the occasional puff of Vin Fizz grape soda. Chapter 5. It was a city of clanging streetcars, screaming newsboys, and the rhythmic, terrifying thump of millions of bricks being laid for the next great skyscraper. It was a place where quiet had been effectively evicted for being a non-paying tenant. But on May 23, 1911, the city decided to build a fortress for the one thing it seemed to have no room for: silence. After 16 years of construction, millions of dollars in white marble, and enough bureaucracy to fill a stadium, the New York Public Library on 42nd Street and Fifth Avenue finally opened its doors. It was a temple to the idea that knowledge shouldn't just belong to the men in the Standard Oil boardrooms, Chapter 2, or the professors at Yale, Chapter 7. It belonged to the public, provided, of course, the public could manage to be quiet for more than 5 consecutive minutes. The reservoir of ink. To understand the majesty of the library, you first have to understand what it replaced. For most of the 19th century, the site was occupied by the Croton Distributing Reservoir. It was a massive, Egyptian-style stone fortress that held the city's drinking water. It had walls 50 feet high and 25 feet thick, designed to hold back the weight of 20 million gallons of liquid. In a rare moment of poetic symmetry, the city decided to replace the reservoir of water with a reservoir of ink. They tore down the stone walls and replaced them with Vermont marble, specifically 530,000 cubic feet of it. The architects, Carrère and Hastings, were practitioners of the Beaux-Arts style, which is a fancy French way of saying, if you can't put a statue of a Greek god on it, it's not finished. The building was designed to be the largest marble structure in the United States. It was so white and so grand that when it was finished, New Yorkers, who are notoriously difficult to impress, actually stopped walking and stared. The two marble sentinels. Guardianship of this temple fell to two massive marble lions sitting on pedestals flanking the entrance. In 1911, they didn't have the names we know today. They were colloquially called Leo Astor and Leo Lenox, after the founders of the library's collections. It wouldn't be until the Great Depression of the 1930s that Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia would rename them Patience and Fortitude, because he believed New Yorkers needed those two virtues to survive the economic collapse. But in 1911, the lions didn't need names to project their message. Their message was simple. If you're coming in here to look for a fight, you have the wrong building. But if you're coming in to look for the history of the Byzantine Empire, please wipe your feet and lower your voice. Mark Twain. The lions were immediately controversial. Some critics thought they were too soft, others thought they were too smug. But the lions just sat there, carved from pink Tennessee marble, watching the 20th century begin to accelerate outside their paws. They watched the Chevrolets, Chapter 6, buzz past, and the men in bowlers hurry to their offices, seemingly the only two beings in Manhattan who weren't in a hurry. The President and the Golden Key. The opening ceremony was a master class in 1911-style big banging. The guest of honor was President William Howard Taft. Taft was a man of significant physical and political gravity, the only president to ever get stuck in a bathtub, and the man who had just presided over the dismantling of the Tobacco Trust. Chapter 3. On that Tuesday morning, in front of a crowd of 15,000 people, Taft was handed a gold-plated key. He used it to unlock the doors, and the public swarmed in. It was a Black Friday for the soul. People weren't rushing for televisions or half-price sweaters. They were rushing for information. The first book requested was a philosophical study titled The Nichuthekalos. The request was made at 9:08 a.m. In a display of efficiency that would make the modern internet blush, the book was located, retrieved from the 7 floors of stacks, and delivered to the reader in exactly 7 minutes. The high-speed library, pneumatic tubes, and dumbwaiters. Behind the quiet marble elegance of the Rosemain Reading Room sat a technological marvel that was purely 1911. The library was essentially a giant steam-powered computer made of paper and brass. To fetch a book from the 75 miles of shelving, the librarians used a system of pneumatic tubes. You would write your request on a slip of paper, stick it in a brass canister, and whoosh! It was sucked through the walls by vacuum pressure to the dark, cavernous stacks below. Once the book was found, it wasn't carried up the stairs by a tired intern. It was placed on an electric conveyor belt, the book train, and whisked up to the delivery desk. The New York Public Library was the only place in the world where you could ask a question and have the answer delivered to you by a gust of air and a miniature railway. It was the Google of 1911, but with better lighting and significantly fewer advertisements for foot-corn cures. Mark Twain. The Rosemain Reading Room, the Cathedral of the Mind. The crown jewel was the Rosemain Reading Room. It was nearly the length of a football field, with ceilings 50 feet high and windows so large they seemed to invite the entire sky inside. This room was a radical social experiment. In 1911, New York was a city of rigid class lines. But inside the library, the Standard Oil millionaire could sit at the same oak table as the immigrant girl who had just escaped the Triangle Factory. Chapter 18. They both had access to the same books, the same light, and the same silence. It was the ultimate public utility. For the price of $0, you could access the collected wisdom of the human race. You could learn how to build a battery, how to fly a plane, or how to properly investigate a missing painting in Paris. The hushed revolution. The opening of the library marked a shift in the 20th century spirit. We were no longer just a world of action. racing cars and dropping bombs. We were becoming a world of access. The library proved that progress didn't just mean bigger machines, it meant bigger thoughts. It established the idea that a city's greatness isn't measured by its reservoirs of water, but by its reservoirs of ideas. By the end of 1911, the library had already seen millions of visitors. It had become the living room of the city, a place where you could escape the noise of the modern life and find a bit of patience and fortitude among the stacks. A library is the only place where you can travel to the South Pole, Chapter 14, visit an Inca city, Chapter 7, and witness a revolution, Chapter 10, all before lunch, and without ever having to worry about frostbite or a rogue grenade. It is the greatest magic trick humanity ever pulled off. We managed to fit the entire universe into a building on 42nd Street. Mark Twain. The takeaway for the tucked in. As you settle into your pillow, imagine the whoosh of a pneumatic tube traveling through a marble wall. Imagine the soft clack of a book being placed on a wooden table and the golden light of the rose reading room fading into twilight. 1911 was the year we gave the modern world a library card. We decided that while the century was going to be fast, it also needed to be thoughtful. We built a house for the books, and we hired 2 lions to make sure nobody bothered them. Rest easy, knowing that the reservoir is full, the knowledge is safe, and the lions are still on duty, watching over the silence so you can find your own. The lights in the reading room are being dimmed, the pneumatic tubes are quiet, and the 20th century is finally taking a breath. Tomorrow, we reach the end of our journey. We look at the year 1912 setting sail, a year that promised to be unsinkable and would prove that even the most velvet-cushioned dreams have to eventually face the cold reality of the Atlantic. But for now, the books are closed, the lions are resting, and the silence is perfect. Chapter 20. 1912 is setting sail. As the final grains of sand slipped through the hourglass of 1911, the world stood back, wiped the grease from its forehead, and admired its handiwork. It had been a year of spectacular out with the old, in with the spectacularly confusing. We had successfully evicted the 19th century, but in our haste to move into the 20th, we hadn't quite checked if the new place had a working fire escape or if the landlord was actually a collection of 34 smaller, angrier landlords in trench coats. 1911 was the year humanity finally stopped pretending it knew what was going on and started embracing the beautiful, high-speed chaos of the modern life. We were a species that could now see behind us without turning our heads, fly across a continent in a machine made of bandages and grape soda, and eat a breakfast made of hardened cottonseed oil without immediately questioning our life choices. The 1911 scorecard, a recap of the absurd. Before we let the clock strike midnight and usher in the year of the iceberg, let us look at the missing smile and the billionaire's divorce one last time. In Paris, the Mona Lisa was still missing, tucked under a handyman's bed like a forgotten Sunday newspaper. The Louvre had learned that a blank space on a wall is a better tourist attraction than a masterpiece, proving that humanity's favorite flavor is and always will be mystery. In the courtrooms of Washington, John D. Rockefeller had been told he was too big to exist, so he became 34 times more present and twice as wealthy. We had learned that you can't kill a monopoly. You can only turn it into a family reunion where everyone owns a different gas station. In the laboratories of Europe, we had been told that we were made of nothing. Rutherford poked the atom and found a void. Onnes froze mercury and found a miracle. We were walking, talking, 99.9% empty spaces that could somehow superconduct a current if we just stayed cold enough. It was a comforting thought. If your life felt empty in 1911, it wasn't a personal failing. It was just fundamental physics. And at the bottom of the map, the South Pole had finally been tagged. Amundsen had won with the quiet efficiency of a man who brought enough dogs, while Scott was still out there, proving that the British Empire was willing to die for the sake of a very heavy collection of fossils and a well-written diary. 1911 was the year we finished the map of the world and started drawing the map of the atom. We had run out of places to hide on the surface, so we started hiding in the subatomic particles. It's a trend that continues to this day, usually in the form of people hiding from their responsibilities in a cloud of data. Mark Twain. Belfast, the Hammer and the Velvet. But while the rest of the world was busy with these distractions, a small corner of Belfast, Ireland, was echoing with the sound of 3 million rivets being hammered into a dream. At the Harland and Wolff shipyard, the RMS Titanic was no longer a blueprint or a skeleton. She was a mountain of iron. She was the final boss of the 1911 philosophy. She was Standard Oil luxury meets Chevrolet ambition, wrapped in a New York Public Library sense of permanence. In late 1911, the ship was being fitted out. This is the part of the process where a giant lethal machine is disguised as a 5-star hotel. Workmen were hauling in thousands of gallons of white lead paint, miles of expensive carpet, and velvet cushions so thick they could swallow a small child. They were installing electric elevators, a swimming pool, and a Turkish bath, because nothing says conquering the North Atlantic like a steam room in the middle of a frozen ocean. The Titanic was the ultimate expression of the unsinkable hubris of 1911. We believed that we had mastered the materials. We had the steel, we had the compartments, and we had the rule of reason. We believed that if you built something big enough and expensive enough, the laws of nature would simply move out of the way, much like a peasant clearing the road for a billionaire's motor car. The omission of the obvious. As the year ended, the designers at Harland and Wolff made a fateful decision, one that perfectly encapsulated the modern mindset. They looked at the deck of the Titanic and decided that it was a bit cluttered. The ship was technically designed to carry 64 lifeboats, but 64 lifeboats looked messy. They blocked the view of the sea. They reminded the wealthy passengers that the ocean was, in fact, a giant cold bucket of water that wanted to kill them. So, in the spirit of 1911, efficiency, they reduced the number to 20. They figured that the ship was its own lifeboat. It was a fortress. To worry about drowning was seen as old-fashioned, a relic of the 19th century when people still respected the power of the tides. In 1911, we didn't respect the tides. We just expected them to provide a nice backdrop for our dinner parties. The year of the great maybe. New Year's Eve, 1911, was a night of profound confidence. We had the telegraph to talk across oceans, the Vin Fizz to fly across plains, and the tabulating machine, chapter 17, to count our blessings. We felt like we had finally solved the puzzle of existence. But as the champagne flowed in the grand ballrooms of New York and London, a large, silent piece of ice was drifting slowly southward from Greenland. It didn't have a name, it didn't have a bow tie logo, and it certainly wasn't worried about the Supreme Court's rule of reason. It was the ultimate third party that the 1911 roadmap had forgotten to include. 1911 was the year of the setup. 1912 would be the year of the payoff. We had spent 12 months building the most impressive, most automated, most scientifically lard-greased society in history, and we were about to enter a year that would remind us that the landlord of the universe still reserves the right to evict anyone he chooses, regardless of how many velvet cushions they have. Man is the only animal that can build a machine so magnificent that it convinces him he is a god, right up until the moment he realizes he's forgotten his swimming trunks. 1912 was waiting in the wings, holding a very large glass of cold water. Mark Twain. The final verdict, 1911, at rest. As we close the book on 1911, fall asleep to Hilarious History, we see a year that was a bridge. On one side, the soot-stained, horse-drawn world of our grandfathers. On the other, the neon-lit, data-driven world of our grandchildren. We left the year with a missing painting that taught us about fame, a broken oil truss that taught us about power, a rear-view mirror that taught us about perspective, a cold, lonely tent at the South Pole that taught us about planning, and a white marble library that taught us that even in a world of machines, we still need a quiet place to think. It was a year of hilarious history because it was a year of human beings doing what they do best, being brilliantly clever and spectacularly oblivious at the exact same time. We were a species that could find an atom's nucleus, but couldn't find a 30-inch painting in a public museum. We were a species that could race for 500 miles on bricks, but couldn't figure out how to lock a factory door safely. The takeaway for the sleepy historian. As you settle into the final silence of this journey, take a deep breath of the 21st century air. Your world is faster, your lard is different, and your monopolies have better websites, but the human spirit remains the same. We are still chasing the missing smile, still racing toward the next pole, and still trying to fit the universe into a manageable box. The lights are going out on 1911. The Vin Fizz has landed. The Marmon Wasp is back in the garage. The Norwegian flag is frozen solid at the bottom of the world, and the Titanic is being polished for its grand debut. Rest easy, knowing that history is a circle, not a line. Everything that has happened will happen again, usually with better special effects and more expensive snacks. You don't need to solve the world's problems tonight. They'll still be there in the morning, and they'll probably be even more standard than they were today. The Mark Twain narration is coming to an end. The ink is dry, the cigar is a nub, and the story of 1911 is officially found. Good night, dear listener. Sleep with the patience of a library lion and the fortitude of an Antarctic explorer. May your dreams be unsinkable, your pillows be made of 99% empty space, and your morning be free of accidental aerial bombardments. The year is ending, the tide is coming in, and 1912 is just over the horizon. The end. This has been Mark Twain.